Hey guys, tonight we enter the dense, low-humming mist of the Bolivian tropics, where the air is heavy, the jungle never sleeps, and the story you're about to hear didn't make headlines so much as it whispered its way into history. Picture yourself deep in the Yungas cloud forest, just before sunrise. The birds are silent, the road is soft underfoot, and the smell of damp earth mixes with diesel fumes. A ranch stands quiet behind high iron gates, cattle grazing in the fog, but armed men barely hidden among the trees. This is where it starts, not in a cartel boardroom, not in Medellin, but in a rancher's paradise where wealth bred silence and silence bred power. Tonight's subject is Roberto Suárez Gómez, a man they called the King of Cocaine before Escobar ever held the title. Banker of death, the man who financed empires, overthrew regimes, and built an invisible machine from jungle clearings and diplomatic handshakes. And you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in his shoes, not because of the bullets, but because of the pressure. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The land is alive with moisture. From above, the eastern Bolivian lowlands look like rippled green velvet. Long before Roberto was feared, he was simply born into it, into cattle, into quiet strength. His father, Suárez Para, was no kingpin, just a wealthy landowner with too much land and too few questions. The hacienda they owned sat comfortably in Beni, a region of isolation and advantage. There were no airports, no press, just airstrips carved into jungle, and men paid well to forget. Roberto grew up amid horses, livestock auctions, and heavy boots on polished floors. His mother was devout. His father was distant. They taught him what mattered most. Don't talk when you should listen. Don't speak names in public, and always know more than you say. Bolivia in the mid-20th century was a place where silence bought survival. By 10, he could ride. By 12, he could assess cattle stock with the sharpness of a banker. People called him quiet, polite, methodical. That would never change. Now here's your historical fact of the hour. Bolivia, unlike Colombia or Peru, wasn't initially seen as a cocaine heavyweight. Its fields grew coca, sure, but the refining and trafficking were someone else's business. That would soon change. As a teenager, Roberto watched as foreign pilots began appearing in Beni, American, Brazilian, occasionally Cuban. They flew low, stayed briefly, and left heavier than they arrived. Rumors stirred, but no one dared confirm them. Even then, Roberto learned, there's more money in not asking. Some say he first touched the edges of cocaine through the cattle trade. That in the early 60s, a quiet side deal financed with beef sales turned into a pilot run of something purer. Many people still think that the very first plane he helped load didn't even carry drugs, but instructions, banking details, contracts, like a dry run. Whether or not that's true, what matters is this. Roberto didn't rush. Unlike the street-level capos who burned hot and fast, he was slow. He built his empire like a rancher raises bulls, carefully, with lineage, patience, and breeding. By 25, he was already managing dozens of workers across multiple ranches. But more interesting were the visitors, men from the capital, uniforms without name tags, priests who didn't pray much. The hacienda, by then, was more than a home. It was a meeting ground. There's a tale, unconfirmed of course, that one day a military helicopter landed without warning. Roberto, just in riding clothes, walked out to meet them. They asked questions. He offered lunch. By sunset, they'd signed a grazing rights deal and flown off. That's how things worked in Roberto's world. He didn't confront. He absorbed. He began quietly financing young coca farmers, paying up front for harvests that weren't even planted yet. This wasn't crime. It was agriculture support. And unlike others, he didn't get his hands dirty. He banked. He invested. When others were hiding labs, Roberto was installing better irrigation. It was cleaner that way. The first sign that something bigger was coming happened in 1973. That year, a Bolivian colonel allegedly gifted Roberto a Swiss watch, a real one, not a knockoff, and whispered that the Americans were starting to sniff around the jungle corridors. Roberto didn't blink. He just nodded, thanked the man, and had the airstrip expanded by 600 meters. Everything was deliberate, quiet, until it wasn't. Roberto's childhood was shaped not by chaos, but by controlled stillness. In the sprawling expanse of Beni, where the land rolled like an ocean of green and the sky threatened rain even on the clearest day, boys learned early that silence kept you safe. Power was never declared. It was felt in the quiet sway of a nod from a rancher's porch, or in the stillness when a conversation turned to names it shouldn't. Roberto was an observant boy. He didn't laugh loudly. He didn't ask too many questions. But he watched everything. He watched how his father's foreman dealt with buyers from Santa Cruz. He memorized the way documents were passed in folded handkerchiefs. He noticed when the same army truck passed the ranch gate twice in one day, but never once honked its horn. That sort of noticing would serve him far more than any schooling ever could. By the time he was a teenager, Bolivia was a country caught in a cycle of coups. One military government fell to another with alarming regularity, like dominoes polished in secrecy and ambition. Yet through it all, the Suárez family seemed to float. They never got involved in politics, but they always knew who was about to win. That kind of foresight was no accident. Roberto's father kept the family at arm's length from La Paz, the capital, preferring to deal with local mayors, colonels, and the occasional missionary. But Roberto saw the pattern. Men in uniform came and went, and their stays coincided with improvements to the ranch, better roads, stronger fences, more radios. He understood early that you didn't need to run the government to own the outcome. You only needed to fund the people who did. This quiet genius for political positioning began to show in subtle ways. In 1965, after a particularly brutal government crackdown on coca farming in nearby regions, Roberto suggested that they hire coca farmers for cattle work, not out of charity, but loyalty. Those workers, displaced and desperate, would remember who gave them shelter when the state gave them grief. It worked. Within a year, the Suárez estate had a reputation for being both safe and generous, a perfect place to host conversations far from the ears of the capital. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 1960s, Bolivia was producing one of the world's largest supplies of raw coca leaf, most of it for traditional use. But that tradition would soon intersect with global demand in ways no government had anticipated. Roberto, always listening, caught wind of a quiet Colombian interest in Bolivian leaf, not the product itself, but the logistics, the jungle, the terrain, the remoteness. Colombia needed staging grounds. Roberto saw the opportunity and, instead of rushing in, he began cultivating trust. And here's where things take a sharp turn into speculation. Many people still think that Roberto was already dabbling in the drug trade by 1968, using cattle exports as a front for transferring money and moving small amounts of processed base paste. Some believe the cattle weren't even the real cargo, just camouflage, but others argue he hadn't touched cocaine directly yet. So what do you think? Was he still just the observant son of a rancher? Or was the empire already under construction, just hidden behind the scent of leather and hay? Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Roberto was no street thug. He never strutted. He rarely raised his voice. But people began noticing that anyone who crossed him, competitors, careless vendors, disrespectful mayors, either left town or found themselves without credit, without cattle, and sometimes without warning. By the early 70s, he had expanded the family's holdings across Beni and into parts of Cochabamba. That's a massive logistical move, and it gave him something no trafficker in Bolivia had ever truly possessed: scale. Hundreds of square miles of rural land, much of it unreachable by police or press. The perfect canvas for something larger. He began constructing what at first looked like basic airstrips. But pilots knew better. These were not crude dirt roads. They were geometrically aligned, lined with lights, camouflaged as farming tools, and maintained like military runways. Word spread among pilots from Colombia and Peru. If you wanted a clean refueling stop where no questions were asked and the men knew their roles, Suarez's land was the place. It wasn't just infrastructure. It was trust. The kind of trust that couldn't be bought, only earned through years of staying quiet when others would brag. Roberto's name wasn't shouted in the streets. It was whispered behind cockpit doors and diplomatic receptions. Back at the hacienda, things remained calm. Roberto dressed well, but not ostentatiously. He attended church on Sundays and made quiet donations to orphanages and churches. He was to most a successful rancher with a heart for the poor. But to those in the know, he was something else entirely. A man who could make your problems disappear, along with your plane, your product, or your debt. At one point, a journalist from Santa Cruz tried to dig into Roberto's land purchases. Within a week, the journalist's office was mysteriously shut down due to unpaid taxes and zoning violations. The reporter relocated to Chile. No article was ever published. It was around this time that Roberto began surrounding himself with men who had no surnames. They called him Patron, though never in public. They wore crisp shirts, carried no weapons, and drove dusty trucks that looked borrowed from real farmers. Every visit to the hacienda came with the same instructions. Arrive after dark. Leave before dawn. Speak only when spoken to. He was building something. You could feel it in the quiet efficiency of his staff, in the sudden presence of guards dressed as ranch hands, in the new antenna that reached just high enough to catch foreign radio frequencies. Something was coming, and everyone around him knew it would be huge. By the mid-1970s, Roberto Suárez Gómez had become more than a rancher. But no one could quite say what he was. There were no arrest warrants, no mugshots, no flashy convoys. Yet when his name was mentioned in certain circles, in La Paz, Bogota, even Miami, people paused. That's how you know power isn't being advertised. It's being felt. His empire still wore the disguise of legitimacy. Fields of cattle grazed peacefully. Contracts with meatpacking companies were flawlessly executed, and his ranches remained model examples of Bolivian productivity. But beneath the pastoral surface, the real business was slowly uncoiling. Quiet, measured, and precise. Roberto never sought control through violence. His influence spread the way ink bleeds through fabric, gradually, silently, and without a central point of origin. If you looked at a map of Bolivia and circled every property he either owned or controlled through proxies, you'd start to see a pattern: narrow valleys, jungle corridors, and forgotten strips of land that led nowhere, unless you knew where they ended. He wasn't alone in the game. Small-time traffickers were beginning to emerge across the country, taking bold but sloppy steps into cocaine processing. But their operations were riddled with risk, loud, poorly guarded, and vulnerable to both government pressure and Colombian manipulation. Roberto studied them all like a botanist cataloging weeds. He didn't interfere. He simply waited until the mistakes removed them from the board. Then he made his move. Instead of starting his own lab, Roberto began financing other people's. Quietly, he funded chemists, refiners, and pilots. He paid for security, upgraded equipment, and covered legal expenses when necessary. In return, he asked for a share of the profits and complete discretion. If someone didn't comply, they were cut off, not harmed, just financially frozen out. And in this economy, that was a death sentence. Here's your historical fact for tonight. Between 1976 and 1980, Bolivia became the world's second-largest exporter of cocaine-based paste, most of it bound for Colombia, where it would be refined and shipped to the U.S. Roberto's fingerprints weren't on the product, but his money was in every plane, every barrel of ether, every new lab generator smuggled over the border. He never micromanaged. His style was managerial delegation with surgical control. One story, possibly apocryphal, says that when a chemist failed to deliver on time, Roberto didn't threaten him. He simply bought the chemist's debt from the middleman and left a note. "Now you work for me. Take your time." The next shipment was early. He earned a reputation not as a kingpin, but as a solution. Got a shipment stuck in customs? Call Suárez. Need to find a trustworthy pilot? Suárez. Want to bribe a regional governor without leaving a trail? Suárez. But it wasn't just logistics. He had charm. That old-school Latin American elegance. He dressed with understated wealth. Linen shirts, pressed slacks, handmade boots. When he spoke, people leaned in. And when he didn't speak, people wondered what he was planning. La Hacienda Suárez, his primary estate in Beni, became something of a legend. Visitors described it as eerily quiet. Staff moved with precision. Everything was impeccably clean, and no one ever used names. You entered through the front gate with one name, and left with another. That was the rule. Still, Roberto maintained the public persona of a generous landowner. He funded schools, donated ambulances, paid for flood relief. His name was etched into the community in marble plaques and whispered favors. He never ran for office, but governors sought his approval before campaigning in Beni. So how did he keep it all running? The answer was systems. He created layers of command, each separated by plausible deniability. His bookkeepers didn't know what the pilots were flying. The mechanics never saw the cargo. The farmers thought they were being paid a premium for organic feed crops. Everyone was technically telling the truth, and that made the empire bulletproof. But every empire needs allies, and Roberto's were powerful. At the time, Bolivia's military was fractured and opportunistic. Coups came and went. In this environment, loyalty wasn't bought with ideology. It was leased with currency. And Roberto had plenty. He began hosting discreet weekend gatherings at the ranch. High-ranking military officers, politicians, and foreign guests arrived via helicopter. They ate well, drank aged scotch, and left with sealed envelopes. It was all very civilized. Many people still think that during one of these weekends in 1977, Roberto negotiated his first major contract with the Medellin cartel. No documents, no signatures, just 3 men in white shirts, shaking hands under a mango tree. So what do you think? Was this the moment Bolivia became a true narco state? Or had that already happened years before? Whatever your answer, that handshake, if it happened, changed the continent, with Colombian partners now relying on him for safe passage and infrastructure. Roberto's power surged. His nickname began circulating quietly. El Banquero de la Muerte, the banker of death. Not because he killed, but because he financed death like a gentleman underwriting risk. Still, he insisted on distance. While Escobar was building zoos and posing for photos, Roberto remained camera-averse. No mugshots, no flashy parties, just the occasional sighting in a quiet corner of Santa Cruz or Buenos Aires, usually accompanied by well-dressed men who seemed more like accountants than killers. By 1978, his network had grown so large that even U.S. officials were hearing whispers. The DEA didn't have much presence in Bolivia then, but what little intelligence they had pointed to one consistent name behind nearly every operation: Suárez. The name became a red flag, but no one could find a fingerprint. And then, just as everything seemed stable, he began reshaping the ranch itself. New construction started. Not homes or barns, but underground bunkers, coded communication towers, and roads that didn't appear on any map. The cattle remained, of course, grazing peacefully. But now they shared their pastures with buried satellite dishes and listening posts. The empire was no longer just a web, it was a fortress. From the outside, La Hacienda Suárez still looked like paradise. Sprawling green fields, tall trees rustling under mountain breezes, and the soft lowing of cattle drifting through the mist. But inside the perimeter, beyond the fences, behind the tasteful stucco facades, a different rhythm had taken over. Not chaos, not violence, but choreography. A machine so disciplined it felt almost military. Roberto had begun transforming the estate into something more than just a logistics hub. He wasn't building an operation. He was crafting a sanctuary. And not just for himself. Guests began arriving under the pretense of cattle business, agriculture conferences, or conservation visits. In reality, these were coded invitations. Men with influence, generals, cartel emissaries, regional politicians, came not to negotiate, but to align. The hacienda became a diplomatic zone in all but name. No weapons were allowed inside. Conversations happened over espresso, not at gunpoint. The decor was simple but impeccable. Leather chairs, polished wood, quiet ceiling fans. Everything was designed to calm the nerves, to whisper, "You're safe here. You're understood." There were no bodyguards in visible sight, but every guest knew the men tending the stables could assemble a rifle in under 20 seconds if needed. Roberto was always deliberate in how he greeted people. One story, shared years later by a Colombian trafficker, goes like this. When he arrived at the hacienda for the first time, he was tense, expecting the usual swagger and suspicion. Instead, Roberto offered him a damp cloth for the heat and asked if he preferred mineral water or still. That was it. No questions, just hospitality. By the time they reached business, the guest was already disarmed. Here's your historical fact for the night. In 1979, Bolivia was approaching the peak of its political instability. Within just a few years, The country cycled through multiple presidents and military coups, each new regime more desperate than the last for funding, control, and survival. It was a playground for someone like Roberto. He began investing in more than just logistics, telecommunications, construction companies, even agricultural cooperatives. On paper, they looked innocent. In practice, they were the perfect vehicles for laundering profits and channeling influence. He didn't just fund the drug trade, he funded the ecosystem that kept it invisible. Do you remember how he started with cattle? He never abandoned that. In fact, his ranching empire expanded during these years, giving him a legitimate backbone to the operation. His cattle were exported to Peru, Brazil, and even Europe. Customs officials waved the shipments through, never knowing or never asking what rode alongside. And it wasn't just livestock, it was information. Roberto's estate became a listening post. Rumors say he paid radio engineers to install towers disguised as agricultural transmitters. They picked up local chatter, sure, but more importantly, they could intercept military bands. This wasn't just about cocaine anymore. This was statecraft. Meanwhile, the hacienda itself evolved into a living metaphor. Its walls, once plaster and wood, were reinforced with steel cores. A new wing was added, never used by family, only by guests who arrived and left without giving names. The kitchen staff doubled, despite no noticeable increase in residents. It was all in the details. He began hosting what some insiders called the silent dinners. No records, no announcements, just a few carefully selected men discussing timelines, shipments, and mutual protection over grilled trout and local wine. Nothing was ever said that could be quoted later, only understood. One former official claimed Roberto had a special room built beneath the estate, a soundproof chamber with no windows, just thick carpets, low lights, and one long table. He called it La Sala Muda, the mute room. There, the real deals were made. Many people still think that in one of those rooms, in late 1979, Roberto made the biggest gamble of his life. He agreed to help finance a coup. Now, this is where the lines blur between fact and legend. Bolivia's 1980 cocaine coup, led by General Luis Garcia Meza, is a matter of historical record. The regime was short-lived, brutal, and deeply tied to drug trafficking. But the question of who bankrolled it, that's where whispers begin. Some claim Roberto provided planes, safe houses, and millions in cash. Others argue he merely knew it was coming and chose not to resist. So what do you think? Was he pulling the strings, or simply profiting from someone else's chaos? Regardless, his behavior shifted after that point. He became more guarded, less visible. The hacienda added more underground tunnels, and visitors were vetted with military precision. All deliveries were scanned. New staff were never told who they worked for, only what to do. Still, the business boomed. The Medellin cartel now relied on Bolivia not just as a transit zone, but as an essential artery. Coca base was being processed in jungle labs, packed into containers, and flown north, often by pilots who never even saw their employer's face. And behind it all, Roberto kept his distance. Always quiet, always clean. He became known among traffickers not as a boss, but as El Caballero, the gentleman. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. But if he stopped funding you, you vanished. Not in a violent way, just in the way that people stop answering your calls. Airports lose your clearances, banks freeze your accounts. Suddenly, you're no one. Roberto didn't need to swing a sword. He just had to remove the sheath and let you wonder. In his private moments, rare though they were, He would walk the ranch in the late evening. Staff described seeing him alone near the stables, hands behind his back, watching the fireflies. No radio, no phone, just silence. Maybe that was his ritual. Maybe that was how he stayed human, because underneath it all, even the banker of death was still just a man trying to keep control of the thing he'd built. A thing that, by now, had grown teeth of its own. Cocaine doesn't arrive like thunder. It seeps in. It finds cracks in the system, then expands with pressure. By 1980, Roberto Suárez Gómez wasn't just playing host to the drug trade. He was quietly directing it, pacing through his hacienda gardens like a conductor leading a silent orchestra of pilots, processors, politicians, and middlemen. He never touched the product. That was his rule. His boots never stepped inside a lab. His fingers never dusted powder. And yet, without his influence, nothing moved. It started small. The first true shift happened when he stopped just financing and began coordinating. He realized early that Colombia had the product and the hunger for global dominance, but Bolivia had something more valuable: silence, remote jungles, fractured government, loyal communities, no paparazzi, no DEA helicopters, just long stretches of forest, where a Cessna could land on a cow path and disappear by dawn. So, Roberto got to work. He mapped the land with topographers under the guise of cattle planning. He paid agronomists to assess soil that he never intended to plant. All of it was for infrastructure: runways camouflaged by vegetation, storage bunkers disguised as granaries, and fuel depots that officially didn't exist. And while the world still thought Bolivia was a coca leaf producer at best, Roberto was midwifing a transformation. He didn't build a pipeline. He built an invisible conveyor belt. Planes would arrive from Colombia, low and slow under the radar, pick up base paste refined in hidden jungle labs, and vanish toward Caribbean refueling points. By the time authorities suspected anything, the money had already changed hands twice and crossed 3 borders. Here's a historical fact for your pillow tonight. In 1980, the UN released reports estimating that 80% of Bolivia's coca paste was being exported to Colombia for further refinement. The growing link between the two nations was no longer rumor. It was a corridor, and Roberto was the toll collector. But what set him apart wasn't just scale, it was style. Roberto didn't shout, didn't posture, didn't rule with fear. He wasn't a warlord. He was a financier with the soul of a chess master. One American intelligence officer later said, "If Escobar was fire, Suarez was fog." And fog, thick, shapeless, hard to grasp, was perfect for a country teetering between democracy and dictatorship. Do you remember the cocaine coup we whispered about? Well, by July 1980, it wasn't just a theory. General Luis Garcia Meza seized power in a bloody, sudden takeover, backed, it is widely believed, by narcotics money. And behind that money, Suarez. That's the story whispered behind locked doors in Santa Cruz and La Paz even now. What did Roberto get in return? Protection, access, immunity. His operations expanded overnight. Military escorts began, guarding routes that just happened to lead to airstrips. Judges declined to prosecute traffickers mysteriously linked to his name. Newsrooms received calls encouraging them to focus on more uplifting stories. Many people still think Roberto had a direct line to Meza's inner circle. Some say he hosted secret planning sessions at the hacienda before the coup. Others claim he only stepped in after the tanks rolled in. So what do you think? Was he the architect, or just a savvy sponsor watching history bend to his advantage? Whatever the truth, the next 12 months became the golden window for Roberto's empire. Colombian planes filled Bolivian skies. Labs doubled their output. Money flowed into real estate, hotels, and offshore accounts. And through it all, Roberto remained the same, measured, polished, untouchable. But success brings attention. And attention, even the quiet kind, brings risk. American intelligence began to shift focus. DEA agents moved closer to Bolivia. Surveillance increased. Questions were asked, carefully but persistently. The problem was, there were no files, no arrests, nothing to link Roberto to the product. He was just a businessman with excellent logistics. Still, the silence was growing thinner. One fateful misstep occurred when a small twin-prop aircraft crashed in the jungle outside Trinidad. Local authorities found no passengers, but they did find sealed drums of ether, bundles of cash, and radio codes traced back to known traffickers. The flight log mentioned a landing zone adjacent to one of Roberto's outer properties. He wasn't implicated. Of course not. But for the first time, his name appeared, softly, in an internal DEA memo. Just 2 words. Monitor Suarez. Back at the hacienda, Roberto adjusted. He stopped taking visitors during daylight. Communications shifted from radios to coded couriers. Even the staff was rotated more frequently, always paid well, always dismissed politely, but rarely allowed to stay long. He knew the storm was forming, and yet he never lost his calm. At one dinner, shortly after the aircraft crash, a Colombian associate asked him if he was worried. Roberto took a sip of his wine, set the glass down carefully, and said, "They only worry when they can prove something. Until then, they just guess." That was his gift. He didn't need to run. He just needed to stay one step inside the shadows. Not invisible, just unprovable. He didn't seek power the way others did. He didn't plaster his face on murals. He didn't buy soccer teams. He bought time. He bought silence. And for a long while, it was enough. Because in the world of cocaine, the loud men burn bright and fall fast. But the quiet ones, the ones who never raise their voice, they last. And Roberto, at this point in the story, was just getting started. By the dawn of the 1980s, the estate in Beni no longer resembled a ranch, at least not to those who knew what to look for. Yes, there were still cattle, and the crops still waved gently in the wind. But now, there were fences within fences, paths that led nowhere, and bunkers hidden under garden sheds. The place was evolving, bit by bit, into a fortress masked as a farm. Roberto Suárez Gómez had engineered a transformation so complete, it felt inevitable. What once had been a sleepy cattle empire had become the most critical node in the Western Hemisphere's cocaine supply chain. And yet, not a single headline bore his name. He wasn't a ghost. He was something more unnerving, a man in plain sight whom no one dared touch. The airstrips were the most important piece. By now, his properties across Bolivia had a network of them, short, narrow, but expertly maintained. To the average eye, they looked like utility roads or dry irrigation paths, but pilots knew. The grooves were clean, the clearings wide enough for nimble aircraft, and the markers subtle but unmistakable. In total, estimates vary. Some say 6 strips, others say over a dozen. What is known is this: they were positioned with chilling precision. Each one was outfitted with refueling capability, diesel buried underground and pumped manually, so no electrical signals could be intercepted. A typical turnaround time? 22 minutes. In and out. No chatter, just coded flashes and silent mechanics. Many people still think this is where Roberto outclassed his peers, not in scale, but in design. His roots operated with the grace of a luxury railway. So what do you think? Is that brilliance or madness? He assigned no names to his pilots. Each received an alphanumeric code. Payment was delivered in cash, sometimes sewn into the linings of crates, other times folded in linen shirts. If a pilot performed poorly, they were rotated out. If they asked questions, they were never invited back. He didn't need loyalty. He needed precision. Here's your historical fact for this leg of the journey. In the early 80s, the DEA began uncovering evidence that Bolivian airstrips were serving as primary refueling stations for Colombian cartels. By 1982, it was suspected that 80% of the Medellin cartel's cocaine shipments passed through Bolivia at some stage, if not in physical cargo, then in financing. And where did that financing come from? One man, one ranch, one soft-spoken banker who kept his fingernails clean and his visitors even cleaner. At the hacienda, daily life operated like clockwork. Breakfast at 7. Staff rotated by shift. Vehicles checked. Radios silenced. There were protocols for every possible outcome. Weather changes, lost cargo, surprise inspections. Roberto's men rehearsed these drills as if they were military cadets. Because in a way, they were. One staff member later recalled that the worst thing you could do wasn't being late. It was being careless. Carelessness, in Roberto's world, was the only real sin. There was one story about a delivery driver who brought a shipment to the wrong gate, off by just 100 meters. The crate was harmless, farm equipment. But still, Roberto personally dismissed the man. No raised voice, just a short conversation in the stables. By sunset, the driver was gone, with severance pay and a permanent note. Do not rehire. Ever, because Roberto didn't build his empire on violence. He built it on control. And nothing disrupted control like sloppiness. He began bringing in engineers, not the flashy kind, but the quiet ones. The ones who could build reinforced storage beneath barns, who could reroute radio towers to mimic civilian channels, who could bury sensors in fence posts. Every upgrade looked like something else. A new barn? Actually, a communication center. A chicken coop? Ventilation for a hidden vault? The estate became a palace of illusions. Meanwhile, he stayed invisible to the public. No interviews, no appearances, no political ambitions. The newspapers didn't write about him because they didn't know where to start. Even when other traffickers were arrested, his name never came up, but the people in charge knew. Judges, governors, army commanders, they all knew, which is why, when the political winds shifted again in 1981 and the Garcia Meza regime began to crumble under international pressure, Roberto didn't panic. He pivoted. He began to diversify. He bought partial ownership in shipping companies. He opened accounts in Europe. He established trade routes that passed through third parties, Peruvian mining firms, Brazilian cooperatives, all real, all documented, all tied together through just enough obscurity to blur the trail. Somewhere during this period, he gained the reputation as a banker without a bank. Not because he held loans or interest, but because every dollar that moved through Bolivia's cocaine trade had, at some point, been touched, briefly, indirectly, by Roberto's fingers. That's how deep he'd embedded himself. And still, at night, he would walk the estate alone, one hand in his pocket, listening to the crickets, observing. Not because he was paranoid, but because this was how he'd always stayed ahead. While others celebrated, he calculated. While others indulged, he fortified. By now, Even the Colombians deferred to him. They knew Bolivia was the bottleneck, the weakest link. If Roberto withdrew his support, his fuel, his timing, his hush, the entire operation stalled. He had made himself essential, not by force, but by design. And that was his genius, because unlike the men with guns, the men with headlines, and the men with gold-plated pistols, Roberto wasn't building a legacy. He was building a system. They called him the banker of death, but it was a misnomer. Roberto Suárez Gómez wasn't a banker in the traditional sense. He didn't sit behind mahogany desks filing loan applications or reviewing balance sheets. He didn't hang plaques on the wall or hand out glossy brochures. No, Roberto was a different breed of financier. He funded operations that no institution would touch, trusted people no government would acknowledge, and processed more cash in a month than most small countries did in a year. His vaults weren't in banks. They were in barns, in underground storage, in the stitched linings of saddlebags. His interest wasn't calculated in percentages. It was enforced by reputation, by subtle implication, by never making the same mistake twice. By the early 1980s, if you wanted to move serious cocaine out of South America, you needed Roberto. Not because he said so, but because the people above you had already made that decision. What set him apart was how clean it all looked. On paper, Roberto's wealth came from livestock, agriculture exports, shipping services, and infrastructure development. His name appeared on charitable foundations, not arrest warrants. His properties were photographed by travel magazines, and when you met him, he was always smiling, always soft-spoken, always one step ahead of your expectations. But everyone in the game knew what he really did. He provided the financial backbone for the continent's deadliest export. Let's talk logistics. A typical narco operation in Colombia involved growing coca, processing it into base paste, refining it into pure cocaine, then shipping it north. Sounds simple, except every step required money. Lots of it. Planes, pilots, chemicals, containers, weapons, bribes, safe houses. Few cartels could cover all of it consistently. That's where Roberto came in. He didn't just finance flights. He pre-funded entire operations. He'd cover the cost of a jungle lab months before a single leaf was harvested. He'd float salaries for security teams guarding cargo they hadn't even seen. He wired money through discreet networks to foreign contacts long before a single gram left the ground, and he expected results. Here's your historical fact. Between 1981 and 1983, intelligence reports estimate that Roberto Suárez was responsible for financing up to 30% of the Medellin cartel's total cocaine output. That's a staggering number, especially considering he didn't directly control any one cartel. Instead, he offered services, like a quiet clearinghouse for organized crime. Many people still think he maintained a secret ledger, an old-fashioned book, handwritten, hidden somewhere on his estate. Inside were names, amounts, flight dates, and debts owed. So what do you think? Did a man that careful trust paper at all? Or is the real ledger buried in stories, in silences, in the blank spaces between rumors? In Santa Cruz, his name became almost mythological. He owned properties across the city, but never appeared at public events. He'd occasionally attend a christening or a funeral, but always as Don Roberto, the cattle baron, never as the man behind the curtain. His reach spread to banks in Panama, shell companies in Switzerland, and logistics firms in Sao Paulo. If a deal needed closing, Roberto didn't show up in person. He sent a handshake in the form of a middleman and a briefcase, and yet, no violence. At least not from him. His closest associates remember him repeating a phrase often: "Violence draws attention. Efficiency draws results." That was his code. Even in emergencies, he never shouted. If a shipment was late, he made a phone call, then waited. If a shipment was lost, he made another call, but never the third. That was the rule. The third call never came. The implication was clear. He had an uncanny ability to remain invisible in plain sight. DEA files from the era describe him as suspected financier or possible facilitator, but none include first-hand sightings or arrests. While men like Escobar and later became media icons, Roberto stayed unsearchable. Just a name passed around over old telex lines and through whispered conversations at diplomatic functions. He was even rumored to have hosted foreign intelligence agents on his estate, not to bribe them, but to understand them, to feel out the edges of their patience. One Bolivian general later claimed Roberto once said, "If you listen long enough, even enemies will tell you what they need." And perhaps that was his real currency. Listening. He listened to his pilots, his engineers, his rivals. He knew what each person feared and what they needed to sleep at night. He built his empire not through dominance, but through availability. He was the person you called when everyone else said no. There's a chilling simplicity to that kind of power. Late one evening, a plane arriving from Colombia touched down at one of Roberto's more remote airstrips. The pilot was new, nervous. He landed too fast, overshot the marker, and tore a tire on the gravel. The crew expected punishment, maybe a blacklisting, maybe worse. Instead, Roberto arrived personally in a simple pickup truck. He examined the damage, nodded, and said, "Replace the tire, make him dinner, let him rest." That pilot later became one of his most loyal flyers, because Roberto knew something few others did. Fear can control men, but respect builds empires. And that empire? It was expanding beyond his own expectation. When the Colombians arrived, they didn't knock. They didn't have to. By 1982, the Medellin cartel had already sent its quietest emissaries to Bolivia. Not soldiers, not capos, but logisticians and engineers. Men who spoke in numbers and flight paths, who asked about topography, not turf wars. They didn't need Roberto Suárez Gómez to smuggle their product. They needed him to make sure the sky stayed open and the fuel tanks stayed full. The alliance wasn't formal. There were no signed deals, but it was real. It started with shared infrastructure. One of Roberto's airstrips in Trinidad began seeing more Colombian-registered aircraft. Then came joint investments. Pilots trained in Bolivia, chemists swapped between jungle labs, radio frequencies aligned to avoid mid-air confusion. What had once been two separate criminal economies, Colombian and Bolivian, now began to function like a single, terrifyingly efficient company. Roberto didn't just welcome it, he optimized it. He created buffer zones, land owned by shell companies, run by locals with no idea who their true employer was. He had brokers establish front companies in Paraguay and Uruguay, then route essential precursor chemicals, ether, acetone, potassium permanganate, through 3 countries before they reached his labs. He streamlined the entire chain so that the Medellin cartel could focus on volume, while he ensured discretion. Here's your historical fact for tonight. During the early 1980s, Bolivia became the world's primary supplier of coca base to Colombia. More than 80% of Colombian cocaine began with paste processed in Bolivian territory. Under the protective eye of men like Suárez, the partnership worked because their personalities complemented each other. Escobar was flamboyant, reckless, beloved by the slums and feared by politicians. Roberto was calculated, restrained, and revered by those who understood that true power often doesn't need to declare itself. A story survives from one of their few in-person meetings, likely in Santa Cruz, in a secluded estate surrounded by tall fencing and thicker silence. Escobar arrived with his usual entourage, armed and loud. Roberto received him in a white guayabera, unarmed, with a glass of water and a folded newspaper. They spoke for hours, reportedly about fuel costs, new drop zones, and the troubling rise in DEA presence. At one point, Escobar allegedly offered him a seat at the Medellin leadership table. Roberto declined, not with insult, but with a smile. "I'd rather own the runway," he said, "than the plane." Many people still think that exchange was the moment Escobar realized he'd never control Bolivia, not while Roberto was alive. So what do you think? Was Roberto the real boss behind the scenes, or just the most efficient service provider in narco history? The collaboration deepened. Colombian engineers began refining Bolivian labs, increasing output. Brazilian smugglers were introduced into the pipeline, reducing reliance on overland Peruvian routes. Money moved so fluidly that at one point, Bolivian pesos began to circulate in parts of northern Colombia simply because of Roberto's pay network. But success bred scrutiny. The Americans, now under Reagan's war on drugs, were beginning to view Bolivia as more than just a source country. They saw it as a haven. Satellite imagery revealed frequent flights to and from obscure airstrips. Intercepted communications mentioned El Patron de la Hacienda. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough for suspicion. Roberto adapted again. He ordered runway schedules to shift every 3 days. He stopped using certain airstrips entirely, letting them grow over with grass, then moved operations 200 kilometers west. He even began alternating the types of planes used: Cessnas, Beechcrafts, crop dusters, anything to confuse surveillance patterns. Meanwhile, the hacienda in Beni grew quieter, more fortified. Guards no longer wore uniforms. Security rotations changed weekly. Deliveries were randomized. Even his own household staff didn't know which buildings were truly in use. But still, the Colombians came. Not capos, never capos, but their smartest men. Roberto worked only with those who could keep up. He once dismissed a Medellin logistics man for asking too many questions. "If you know everything," he reportedly said, "you're a risk to everyone." He preferred simplicity. One instruction, one response. Everything else was clutter. To the outside world, he remained a rancher. He still donated to schools, still attended mass, still maintained his cattle business with laser focus. In fact, his beef exports expanded during this period, providing the perfect justification for fuel, trucks, and refrigeration units that were, in reality, repurposed for less savory tasks. He wasn't hiding the money. He was dressing it in boots and feeding it hay. DEA analysts, years later, would admit in declassified memos that Roberto Suárez was a logistical ghost. No hard intel, no photos, no confirmed meetings. Just a name that kept showing up in association with people who vanished before questioning. Even the Bolivian government, shifting once again under pressure from the US, hesitated to move against him. Why? Because by then, Roberto wasn't just a criminal. He was part of the economic fabric. He employed thousands, donated millions, and most crucially, held the secrets of powerful men. And he never threatened to reveal them. That wasn't his style, but everyone knew. If you pushed him too hard, the silence he wielded so carefully could unravel, and the names stitched into his empire would not survive the light. Somewhere in the Bolivian lowlands, just off a rutted dirt road only locals used, a patch of jungle had been cleared. Not all the way, just enough. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd miss it. It wasn't on any map. From above, It looked like nothing but a stretch of damp grass. But to those in the know, it was one of Roberto Suárez Gómez's most trusted airstrips. They called it La Cinta Verde, the green ribbon. It was narrow, muddy in the rainy season, but it was functional, and most importantly, it was invisible to satellites unless someone happened to catch it between landings. The jungle canopy grew close on both sides, offering both shade and secrecy. This was one of many such ribbons scattered across his properties. But it was the first, the prototype. And by the early 1980s, it was receiving flights almost daily. Small aircraft coming from the south with chemicals, and others from the north, touching down to refuel before slipping back into Colombian airspace. Cargo holds heavy with coca paste. Every plane had a code. Every takeoff time was adjusted daily. There were no control towers, just a lone man with a radio and a white sheet, waving signals like some forgotten railway flagger. It was crude, but it worked. More often than not, the planes arrived within seconds of their scheduled time. That was Roberto's influence, Swiss precision hidden in South American foliage. He rarely visited these sites himself. That wasn't his role. He had managers, men with calm voices and sharper memories. Every landing logged in shorthand. Every crate counted twice. Every barrel of fuel signed for by a man who only used his first name. Here's your historical fact. Bolivian law enforcement in the early 1980s was almost entirely untrained in aerial surveillance or narcotics interdiction. The country had no national radar coverage, making these jungle runways nearly impossible to detect in real time. This meant Roberto operated with near impunity, so long as no one spoke too loudly or crashed in the wrong place, and most didn't. The flow of product grew smoother by the month. Each base lab in the jungle fed into the airstrips. Each plane took the paste to Colombia. From there, the Medellin cartel worked its magic, refining it, cutting it, packing it, and sending it northward by sea, land, and sky. But that first step, that critical handoff from Bolivia to Colombia, that was Roberto's domain. Many people still think the entire early infrastructure of the Medellin cartel would have collapsed without these runways. So what do you think? Was Suárez simply a subcontractor, or was he the spinal cord of the entire trade? Whatever the answer, by 1983, the DEA knew of at least 9 active runways tied to his land holdings. They just couldn't do anything about it. They tried pressuring the Bolivian government. They tried infiltrating his network. But time and again, they found only half-truths. Pilots disappeared before questioning. Radio logs went missing. Documents turned up charred, and the few men who could place Suárez at the center of anything simply stopped talking or stopped showing up altogether. Meanwhile, La Cinta Verde remained busy. The surrounding community didn't complain. Why would they? Jobs were stable. Roads were paved. Schools had books. Local mayors found campaign envelopes stuffed with cash. Roberto didn't rule by fear. He ruled by benefits. There's a story, a local legend really, that one day a plane skidded off the runway and clipped a mango tree. The pilot wasn't hurt, but the tree came down. By morning, 3 mango trees had been planted in its place, and the pilot had been served breakfast at the estate with a handwritten apology note from Roberto himself. Because mistakes were forgiven once, efficiency always was the religion. That attitude extended beyond Bolivia. In Panama, Roberto allegedly owned interest in 2 logistics firms and had a man stationed near the canal. His job? Nothing glamorous, just watching the weather reports and alerting captains about the best departure windows for Colombia-bound ships. But when you're moving millions in illegal product, knowing which night the fog rolls in is worth more than gold. In Honduras, Roberto reportedly invested in a small maintenance hangar that doubled as a refueling site for planes in distress. No questions were asked, no receipts issued. He never put his name on anything. That was the trick. You could trace his influence across the continent, but not his fingerprint. Yet despite the breadth of his empire, he still returned often to his original hacienda. La Hacienda Suárez was not just home. It was the beating heart of the entire operation. Staff reported seeing him walk the grounds every Sunday evening, alone, without bodyguards. He would pause near the edge of the pastures, stare at the horizon, and then disappear into the trees, sometimes for hours. Maybe he was checking something. Maybe he was just reminding himself where it all began. Because for all his precision, there was a side of Roberto that remained sentimental. He never allowed the hacienda chapel to be altered. It remained untouched. The same stone benches, the same wooden crucifix. Every Easter, a mass was held there. Quiet, unpublicized, attended only by those who knew not to ask questions. Some believe it was his way of asking forgiveness. Others think it was just part of the disguise. Either way, the planes kept coming. Day after day, low and quiet. Their shadows skimmed the tops of trees. Their pilots didn't speak. Their missions, always the same. Land, refuel, lift off, and somewhere behind it all, Roberto was counting. Always counting. It's 1980. La Paz shivers under the weight of political uncertainty. Soldiers line the streets, faces unreadable beneath mirrored sunglasses. The government changes hands, again. Flags come down, new ones go up. And behind closed doors, phone calls are made on rotary lines that click with tension. Then suddenly the phones stop ringing. General Luis Garcia Meza has taken power. What history would call the cocaine coup unfolds not with parades or slogans, but with arrests, disappearances, and silence. And behind that silence, behind the coup itself, many believe stands a man who never appears on the nightly news, never waves from balconies, and never signs public decrees. Roberto Suárez Gómez. He doesn't enter the palace. He doesn't pose with medals. But his influence, like a fog rolling through highland valleys, settles over the capital without resistance. He is the man who makes things happen. Not because he threatens, but because he provides. The new regime needs money. Roberto has it. The army needs air support. Roberto knows pilots. The ministers need foreign currency to pay off promises. Roberto has offshore accounts. He doesn't name his price. He names his expectations. Freedom of movement, he says. Operational peace, and he gets it. Here's your historical fact to anchor tonight's shadows. The 1980 Bolivian coup was widely believed to have been supported, if not orchestrated, by drug traffickers. The new military regime became a haven for cocaine operations, turning a blind eye as the business expanded to unprecedented levels. At the center of this boom was a man whose name didn't appear on any official ledger, but whose money touched everything. The generals saw in Roberto something they didn't understand, but instinctively feared: permanence. They were temporary. He was built to last. La Paz became an open city. Flights came and went without questions. Customs officers looked away. Judges deferred. Anyone who raised concerns was transferred, dismissed, or found themselves accused of other, less forgivable offenses. At one point, an opposition senator tried to hold a press conference to denounce narco-corruption. The building lost power 5 minutes before airtime. It didn't come back for 6 hours. The next day, the senator retracted his statements and requested a leave of absence for health reasons. Back at the hacienda, Roberto didn't gloat. He adjusted. He upgraded his fleet. No longer just small aircraft, but larger twin turboprops capable of heavier loads. He hired engineers to reinforce runways. He expanded underground storage. And he began requiring biometric verification for sensitive operations, a step that wouldn't become standard elsewhere for another decade. This wasn't ego, this was infrastructure. Many people still think this was Roberto at his peak. Not in money, but in mastery. So what do you think? Was the man a criminal genius, or a logistics savant whose talents simply found the most lucrative application? He wasn't just helping himself anymore. He was stabilizing an entire regime, albeit one built on fragile promises and smoky backrooms. His money filled budget gaps. His pilots transported high-ranking officials. His land offered safe passage to people who couldn't appear in public. In exchange, he asked only for freedom, the freedom to operate, to move, to build. And build he did. Entire sections of the countryside became known unofficially as zonas de silencio, zones of silence. Police didn't patrol them. Helicopters didn't fly overhead. Reporters didn't visit. These weren't hostile territories. They were managed ones, curated by Suárez like a museum of efficiency. When questioned about these areas by foreign press, a government spokesperson once replied, "There are no known issues in those zones," which was true, because no one was allowed to know. Roberto even began developing what appeared to be legitimate infrastructure: roads, bridges, rural clinics, all real, all functional, all serving dual purposes. A new highway might provide access to a village, and also create a faster route for product to reach a key airstrip. A water treatment facility might improve public health, and also serve as cover for buried radio lines. And throughout it all, he remained calm. When questioned, even internally, he never denied anything. He simply changed the subject, or he'd offer a joke, low and dry. "You think I'm that clever? I just raise cows." But behind the smile, he monitored everything. Flight manifests, radio chatter, customs schedules. He had eyes in the capital, in the jungle, and in 2 foreign embassies, though he never said which. There's a moment that gets mentioned often by former staff, though never confirmed. One night, during a particularly volatile week when American agents had arrived unannounced in La Paz, Roberto gathered his closest aides in the dining hall. The windows were shuttered, the lights dim. A single candle flickered in the center of the long table. He poured everyone a glass of wine. Then he said, "They'll huff, they'll puff, but they won't find the door. We are the house." He wasn't wrong. The Americans couldn't touch him. Not then. Not with the generals in power and the economy quietly thriving on narco dollars. Bolivia's official exports were still meager, but imported goods flooded in. New cars, televisions, designer clothes, all paid for with money no one dared trace. The only ones who complained were farmers. Not about Suárez, but about the middlemen. Prices fluctuated. Fields were pushed harder. Some communities resisted the expansion, but those protests faded quickly, softened by sudden donations or quiet changes in leadership, because nothing stood in the way of the system Roberto had built. Not for long. At night, the planes still came. Not hundreds. Not yet. But enough. Enough to keep the empire humming. Enough to make the silence grow heavy. The Chapare region of Bolivia was never supposed to matter. Nestled between mountains and forest, too humid for comfort, too remote for tourists, it was the kind of place even maps hesitated to define. But by 1981, it had become the beating heart of a billion-dollar empire. And at the center of that heart, unseen, unshouted, but always present, was Roberto Suárez Gómez. Chapare was perfect, not just because it grew coca, but because it grew loyalty. Its farmers had few options. Roads were bad, government attention sparse. But when Roberto came, he didn't bring promises. He brought infrastructure. He funded roads, real ones. Gravel at first, then paved. He sent mobile clinics into the villages, offered schools supplies without asking for headlines. And in return, he asked for just one thing. Don't ask questions about the plains, the region responded. Fields once used for bananas and coffee were converted, row by row, into coca cultivation zones. It wasn't coercion, it was economy. Coca paid 5 times more and didn't rot in transport. When Roberto offered to buy harvests in bulk, cash up front, no delays, the decision became simple. That's how Chapare became what some later called Cocaine Valley. Not a war zone, not a slum, but a rural machine humming along on crop cycles, radio towers, and the quiet understanding that Roberto's money made life better. Here's your historical fact. By 1983, Bolivia had become the largest single source of coca paste in the world. Nearly all of it flowed from Chapare, often through small labs funded indirectly by Suárez. It was processed, packed, and handed off to pilots who used the nearby jungle airstrips like bus stations. But what made Roberto different wasn't just scale. It was how deeply he embedded into the region. He didn't hover above it like a distant dawn. He integrated. He hired local foremen to manage operations, trained villagers as radio operators, paid bonuses for reliability. Each person had a role. No one saw the whole picture, but each understood their piece of it, like a grand orchestra where no one had ever read the full sheet music. Yet somehow the symphony played on. The Chapare operation was built on redundancies. Each lab had a backup. Each radio signal had an alternate frequency. Even the cash routes had shadows. Young men on motorcycles ferrying envelopes along side trails too narrow for trucks. If one piece failed, the others kept moving, like a spider web that could tremble without breaking. And Roberto, of course, watched it all, not from a high tower, but from quiet rooms with maps on the walls and coffee on the table. His notes were handwritten, often on repurposed cattle ledgers. Dates, names, symbols. Only he understood the code, not because he distrusted his staff, but because some knowledge needed to stay singular. There's a story from this time, a quiet, unconfirmed one, that the DEA attempted to plant an informant in Chapare. A chemist, trained in Colombia, sent to gain access to a jungle lab linked to Suárez. Within a week, the man disappeared. No body, no message. But a few days later, a bouquet of flowers was delivered to the U.S. Embassy in La Paz. No card, just a single coca leaf tied to the ribbon. What it meant was never confirmed, but the embassy reportedly doubled its security that day. Many people still think Roberto had a hand in training an entire generation of chemists, not directly, but through funding technical manuals, importing lab equipment, and arranging safe passage for Colombian experts to teach their Bolivian counterparts. So what do you think? Was he building an army, or just investing in quality control? He certainly had standards. If a batch was too impure, he wouldn't accept it. If a pilot deviated from flight plans, they were replaced, not punished, just removed. He treated his network like a machine, and each component had to run without friction. Even in Chapare, that meant consequences. One village, paid to supply fuel and food to a hidden runway, began siphoning extra diesel and selling it on the side. Roberto didn't send armed men. He sent accountants, quiet men with clipboards, who closed the airstrip within 2 days. The village lost all business. Within a month, they asked for forgiveness. and were granted a second chance, because this wasn't war, it was management. Back at the estate, the reports from Chapare arrived daily. Handwritten ledgers, marked with stamps no one could trace. Deliveries, weights, flight codes. Roberto read them over breakfast. Rarely commented. Occasionally underlined a number. His silence was either approval or death. No one was sure, so they always assumed the latter. But he wasn't cruel. He simply demanded excellence. He began exploring additional routes. Rivers, mostly. Shallow boats with hollowed floors. Quiet trips through tributaries that led into Brazil. Chapare became more than a source. It became the origin point for experimentation. If a new tactic worked, it was scaled elsewhere. If it failed, it vanished without record. And through it all, the money kept flowing. To Miami, to Panama, to Geneva. It passed through Bolivian hands for only a moment. Just long enough to keep the farms alive, the clinics running, the roads smooth. At night, in Chapare, the crickets sang through jungle heat. The stars overhead seemed impossibly close. And somewhere in the distance, a small plane lifted off from a hidden clearing. Its lights off, its wings steady. It didn't need to see the path. It trusted the system. By 1983, the pressure in Bolivia was rising. Not just the heat in Chapare or the rumble of boots through La Paz, but something quieter and more ominous. American intelligence had begun to circle the country like a flock of silent vultures, watching from high above, waiting for movement. Roberto Suárez Gómez had never been indicted, never arrested, never even photographed in the context of cocaine. But his name, finally, had made its way onto paper. Classified reports, handwritten notes, redacted memos passed between embassies. The CIA had questions, and when the CIA has questions, people start to disappear. Roberto knew this. He didn't panic. He adapted. He always did. He ordered new protocols. Lab sites in Chapare were halved in size and doubled in number. Supply chains were fragmented. No single courier carried more than one set of documents. Radio codes changed weekly. Pilots were shuffled, trained, and then sent off to fly in pairs, one as a decoy, the other as payload. He began to suspect that certain routes had been compromised, likely by American surveillance from neighboring countries. So he rerouted traffic through Honduras, bribing his way into military-controlled airfields with the kind of precision you'd expect from a man who managed invisible empires. That's when the whispers started. Ir en contra. American cargo planes leaving Latin America half full. Rebels in Nicaragua. Weapons going in one direction, narcotics in another. And somewhere in that tangle of deniable operations and off-the-books transactions, a name kept surfacing. Roberto Suárez Gómez. Now, here's your historical fact, and it's one of the stickiest ones. Declassified documents and investigative reports from the late 1980s suggest that certain U.S.-backed operations may have knowingly allowed narcotics trafficking through Central America in order to fund anti-communist efforts. Bolivia, particularly Roberto's network, was perfectly positioned to be a part of that corridor. No proof, just implications. So, what do you think? Was Roberto manipulating global powers to expand his reach? Or was he merely being used by people whose hands were dirtier than his own? Whatever the truth, he played his role well. He began investing in Honduras, quietly, through intermediaries. A cattle operation, a telecommunications firm, nothing flashy. Just enough to buy space, to rent silence. He also began hiring new types of advisors. Not just logisticians and pilots, but lawyers fluent in extradition treaties, experts in Swiss banking, men who understood how to erase presence from paperwork. He started holding meetings in Panama, sometimes in rented villas guarded by off-duty soldiers, other times on anchored yachts where engines never turned off, just in case someone needed to leave fast. And still, back at the hacienda, everything looked calm. Staff swept the floors. Coffee was served at dawn. Mass was held on Sundays. Roberto still walked alone at dusk, a straw hat tilted low over his brow. You wouldn't think him the epicenter of a global scandal, but you also wouldn't ask twice. La Paz, meanwhile, was beginning to shiver under its own weight. The regime Roberto once bankrolled was collapsing. Garcia Meza was gone, exiled, disgraced. Trials loomed. The Americans were getting bolder. One day, a reporter knocked on the gate of a property near Trinidad, supposedly owned by a shell company connected to Suárez. He asked questions, took photos, left with nothing more than images of grazing cattle and men in wide-brimmed hats. 3 days later, the reporter published a piece about Bolivian wildlife preservation. Nothing else was said, because Roberto didn't need to threaten anyone. He just had to wait. Still, the heat was real. The DEA began pushing for operations inside Bolivia. Advisors were dispatched, partnerships proposed, training offered to local units. And every time the conversation turned toward targeting infrastructure in Chapare, someone in the Bolivian government raised a concern. Too dangerous, they'd say. Too unstable. What they really meant was too close to Suárez. The CIA, too, began shifting its approach. Instead of going after Roberto directly, they tried to work around him, cutting deals with rivals, offering immunity to lesser traffickers in exchange for testimony. But no one came forward. Because here's the thing, Roberto didn't betray, and in return, he wasn't betrayed. His rule was old school. You didn't get rich fast. You got rich slowly, carefully. And if you stayed loyal, you were never left behind. He funded retirements, covered medical bills, bought properties for aging pilots. His loyalty was expensive, but absolute. Even the Colombians respected it. At one meeting in Cartagena, a mid-level trafficker reportedly asked why Suárez wasn't expanding his territory like Escobar or later. Why didn't he push into Miami, into New York? Roberto reportedly laughed, leaned back in his chair and said, "Because kings don't chase the parade. They build the road." He didn't need recognition. He had leverage, and he used it. He also became increasingly obsessed with security. His estate was swept weekly for bugs. Vehicles were inspected for tracking devices. Visitors were background checked, even the ones he'd known for years. He began sleeping in different rooms each night, not out of fear, but as a precaution. His estate had more false doors than real ones. There's a story, again unverified, that during this time, Roberto discovered one of his senior aides had accepted a bribe from an American contact. He didn't confront the man. He didn't fire him. He simply sent him on a business trip to a property near the border. The man never returned. No questions were asked. The position was filled the next day. Because by 1983, this wasn't just about cocaine anymore. It was about survival. Not in the street-level sense, but at the scale of nations, treaties, and competing intelligence operations. Roberto Suárez Gómez wasn't running from the law. He was walking beside it, unnoticed, holding a briefcase. And in that briefcase, maps, ledgers, and perhaps, if the rumors are true, a list of names that no government wanted printed. Golden hours in Bolivia look like magic. Sunlight cutting through jungle mist, rivers glowing like strips of bronze, and shadows stretching long over fields that hold more secrets than crops. And in the early 1980s, those golden hours belonged to Roberto Suárez Gómez. This was his era of untouchable power. The generals owed him. The traffickers relied on him. The Americans though suspicious, had yet to find the leverage they needed. He was the silent broker in a loud, dangerous market. And in those few short years, his fortune ballooned into something beyond wealth. Something more like myth. He never flaunted it. There were no golden AKs, no pet tigers, no luxury estates on foreign shores. His splendor was quiet, calculated. But those who visited the mansion in La Paz, his urban base of operations, never forgot it. They called it La Casa Silenciosa, the silent house. From the outside, it looked modest. White walls, a narrow gate, trimmed hedges. But step inside, and the illusion dissolved. Marble floors, chandeliers from Murano, original colonial paintings, a study lined with first edition books and diplomatic memorabilia from embassies that claimed to have never heard his name. It wasn't just luxury, it was coded luxury. Everything meant something. The furniture placement discouraged lingering. The doors were soundproof. The glasses were always polished, but no one ever heard the clinking of ice. Every meeting in that house followed a script. Guests were escorted in silence. Conversations were held in hushed tones, and all notes were burned at the end of the evening. Some say there was a room, always locked, that contained nothing but a single chair, a light bulb, and a telephone that never rang, just in case someone ever needed to wait for an answer that would never come. Here's your historical fact. Despite all of Roberto's operations, his name never once appeared in a Bolivian court record during the peak years of his reign. No charges, no warrants, no trials. He was, legally speaking, invisible, but his presence was everywhere. Ministers who owed him favors kept their mouths shut. Governors who had benefited from his infrastructure investments turned their gaze elsewhere. Judges who received anonymous donations to their children's schools found nothing suspicious in that. He didn't ask for loyalty. He designed dependency. In Santa Cruz, he owned properties he never visited, just in case someone needed a place to lie low. In Cochabamba, he owned a factory that didn't produce anything, but employed dozens, simply to keep families grateful and municipal inspectors confused. In Sucre, a university scholarship fund bore no name, but its recipient list was handpicked by one of Roberto's aides. He wasn't just laundering money, he was laundering influence, and the product? Still moving. Flights from Chapare lifted off like clockwork, some bound for Colombia, others for Central America, where distribution could be redirected through Mexico or even Florida. Roberto didn't ask where the final destinations were. He only ensured the middle steps stayed invisible. His labs, refined by Colombian expertise, now produced paste at a rate that stunned even veteran traffickers. One estimate, drawn from later intelligence reports, claimed that his operation alone moved over 1,000 kilos of base paste a week. And yet, not one photo, not one fingerprint, just whispers. Even Escobar, known for his impatience, once remarked, half in admiration, half in frustration, that Suárez hid better than God. But not everyone was content. Within Roberto's orbit, a few voices began to grow restless. Some wanted expansion, more risk, faster payouts. And leading that push was someone Roberto knew all too well, his son, Jorge. Jorge had his father's poise, but not his patience. He was younger, sharper in fashion, quicker to anger. He understood the network, but not the rules that kept it alive. He saw how men like Later were making headlines, building fortresses, buying islands. He wanted that kind of legacy, the kind that shouted. And Roberto? He wanted silence. Many people still think this was the beginning of the empire's decline, not in power, but in harmony. So what do you think? Can an operation this vast survive two visions? Or does ambition, when paired with blood, always break something? For now, Roberto managed the tension. He allowed Jorge to run side operations, low-risk logistics in neighboring countries, minor lab upgrades, even a small airstrip of his own. But everything was monitored. Carefully, Jorge's successes were quietly celebrated. His mistakes, of which there were several, were cleaned up before word spread. But the cracks were showing. One pilot loyal to Jorge made an unscheduled landing near Tarija, spooking a regional police unit. Another associate tried to expand into Argentina without clearance from local traffickers. Favors had to be called in. Money had to move quickly. It was messy. And Roberto hated messy. Back in La Paz, La Casa Silenciosa remained still. Visitors noticed Roberto spent more time alone in his study. The books remained open longer. The phone calls were shorter. He seemed distracted, not panicked, but burdened, because for the first time in years, the empire wasn't tightening. It was expanding without his direct control, and that was dangerous. He knew the Americans were watching. The DEA now had a semi-permanent presence in La Paz. The CIA had begun making contact with former Bolivian officials, probing, fishing for defectors, trying to piece together the invisible puzzle of Suárez's network. And somewhere inside that puzzle, Jorge had become a wild card. But Roberto, ever the planner, wasn't ready to give up the game. Not yet. He began preparing contingencies, false identities, hidden cash reserves, alternate routes out of the country, even a possible relocation. Brazil, perhaps, or Panama, places with weak extradition and strong currency exchange. He hadn't lost. He was simply calculating. Because even legends like Roberto Suárez Gómez know one thing for certain. The moment you stop preparing is the moment the lights go out. In the heart of La Paz, just a few blocks from the Parliament building, there stood a mansion that most people walked past without noticing. It wasn't grand in the way you'd expect. No guards at the gate, no exotic cars on the street. Just a white-walled estate with trimmed ivy and a quiet confidence. To the unknowing, it belonged to some forgotten colonial family. To those in the loop, it was Roberto Suárez Gómez's stronghold in the capital. It didn't run like a hideout. It operated like a ministry. Inside, everything was curated. Not opulent, just exact. A single step into the marble foyer, and you felt the temperature drop. The air smelled faintly of cedar and paper. There were no paintings of saints, no busts of heroes. Only maps, framed, detailed, annotated. The walls whispered utility. Every hallway led somewhere and nowhere, depending on who you were. This mansion was not where the drugs were moved or the money counted. It was where power was sustained. Here's your historical fact for tonight. In the early 1980s, Bolivia's capital was home to a revolving door of presidents, many of whom lasted only months. Roberto's presence, in contrast, was uninterrupted. It didn't matter who held office. He remained constant, and that constancy bought him leverage. Every Thursday afternoon, the mansion hosted a dinner that wasn't really a dinner. Guests were limited, never more than 6. A judge, a colonel, a banker, a priest, sometimes a foreign diplomat. The rules were simple. No notes, no second helpings, no raised voices. Conversations ranged from infrastructure grants to agricultural permits, to the sudden retirement of a local prosecutor who had become too curious. No one discussed cocaine. No one had to. One night, a senator asked, half joking, if Roberto had ever considered politics. He answered without smiling, "Power is safer without applause." It became a mantra, one he lived by. But even his serenity had its limits. As Jorge Suárez grew bolder, the quiet rhythm of the mansion began to change. Roberto's staff noticed subtle shifts. More guards, new safes, background checks on long-time employees. Even the kitchen schedule was randomized. Meals prepared in 3 locations and delivered under code. Jorge wanted to modernize, streamline. Digital ledgers, encrypted radios, younger crews with less baggage. Roberto didn't forbid it, but he watched closely. Then came the cardinal sin: attention. Jorge was photographed at a nightclub in Santa Cruz, champagne in hand, surrounded by men who shouldn't have been in the same room, let alone the same photo. That image never made the papers, but it made its way to U.S. intelligence. The DEA was already assembling a dossier. The CIA had begun compiling a narcotics influence chart with names, arrows, and unanswered questions. And now, for the first time, a second Suárez name appeared. Many people still think that photo was a test balloon from an informant. Bait, set to see how the network would respond. So what do you think? Was Jorge careless? Or was someone trying to smoke out the man behind the curtain? Either way, the curtain began to flutter. Roberto responded quickly. He grounded several aircraft, paused lab operations in Chapare for 72 hours, issued sweeping orders through intermediaries, destroy files, change routes, suspend risky contacts. It was the kind of reset he hadn't ordered in years. But not all problems could be solved with orders. The mansion in La Paz, once a hub of calm, began to receive uninvited guests, foreign reporters, opposition politicians, legal requests for property audits, all of it unofficial, all of it deniable, but all of it worrying. And then, unexpectedly, came a visitor Roberto hadn't anticipated, a bishop. He arrived without an appointment, accompanied by 2 priests and a folder. Inside was a request for donation, not an unusual one, but it came with a warning wrapped in scripture. Even the wise must prepare their house for flood, the bishop said, gently closing the folder. Roberto gave the donation. He doubled it, but afterward, he ordered his files burned, not all, just enough, because when churchmen begin sending coded messages, the storm is no longer at sea. He held a final dinner that month. Only 3 guests. No alcohol. Just strong coffee and maps spread out across the dining table. One guest, a retired colonel, asked whether it was true that the Americans had satellites overhead, snapping photos. Roberto nodded. But they still need us to explain what they see. That was the truth. The DEA had images, coordinates, flight paths, but no context, no confessions, no leverage, not yet. And so, La Casa Silenciosa stayed open, but quieter. Fewer dinners, more locks, a rotating staff. Jorge was sent abroad for business. Flights were cut in half. Production slowed. Roberto began attending Mass more frequently. He also made subtle changes, divesting small properties, consolidating accounts, moving shares into the names of people no one would trace. It wasn't retreat. It was rebalancing, because Suárez didn't believe in surrender. He believed in timing, and at that moment, the timing told him one thing. The spotlight was getting warm, so he stepped a little further into the shadow, not hiding, just watching. Jorge Suárez returns with a tan and a suitcase that weighs more than it should. It's 1984, and he's been in Panama, then Brazil, then a brief stopover in Madrid. He says he's made contacts, young men with new planes, new software, new ideas. He speaks of encrypted radios, faster lab yields, and partnerships with up-and-coming traffickers from Mexico who are ready to do business the modern way. Roberto listens. He doesn't speak, not at first. Instead, he pours 2 small glasses of anise liqueur and watches the steam from the garden slip under the dining room door. The silence stretches long enough to make Jorge uncomfortable. Then Roberto says only this: "The jungle doesn't care about upgrades, it only cares what survives." Jorge doesn't understand. Or maybe he does, but he doesn't want to. The rift between father and son is no longer quiet. It simmers behind closed doors, laced with generational difference and the unmistakable scent of impatience. Jorge sees opportunity. Roberto sees exposure. Back in Chapare, the system still functions, but with more friction. Younger operatives are moving faster, cutting corners. A new pilot crashes outside Riberalta, drawing attention. One of Jorge's men attempts to buy military fuel without the usual paperwork. A border patrol agent near Cobija reports seeing night flights, an event that used to be unthinkable. Roberto is no longer angry. He's tired of fixing leaks sprung by ego, tired of retraining men who never understood the value of waiting, and so he begins to consolidate. He sells off several holdings in Santa Cruz, using proxies, quiet sales, no attention. He closes 3 airstrips. He dissolves 2 lab sites in Chapare and relocates their chemists. He begins drafting what one aide calls the soft exit. Here's your historical fact. In 1984, the United States and Bolivia signed the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, which formally enabled greater cooperation between the 2 countries on narcotics investigations. This shift meant the era of deniable operations and diplomatic blindfolds was coming to an end. Roberto saw it coming months earlier. He began moving money. Not just laundering, liquidation. Hard assets turned into bearer bonds. Gold purchased in Europe. Swiss accounts opened under foundations with names like Andean Agricultural Trust. There was no panic, just strategy. And yet, within the network, there was friction. Many people still think Roberto was preparing to hand off power entirely to Jorge. Others believe he was preparing to vanish. So, what do you think? Was he orchestrating a generational transfer, or writing his own quiet ending? Either way, the empire was changing, and Jorge, emboldened by his father's restraint, took bolder steps. He expanded ties with Mexican traffickers. He pushed for new jungle routes through northern Brazil. He began experimenting with semi-submersible craft, a concept so ahead of its time it sounded like fiction. But it wasn't. Not to Jorge. And Roberto watched, not with pride but with calculation. He began limiting Jorge's access to certain contacts. He stopped signing documents himself. His signature vanished from paperwork. His voice stopped appearing on recorded lines. He was ghosting his own empire, and in doing so, he became harder to find, not just by enemies, but by allies. He also began writing, a habit he hadn't practiced since his early days. Longhand notes, personal reflections. No ledger, no confessions, just thoughts. The jungle taught me that wealth is not what you hold, but what you can walk away from. Loyalty is not given, it's calculated. Even silence gets tired. And then one night, he burned them all. Not out of fear, but finality. His world was changing, whether he liked it or not. Technology was catching up. Ambition was accelerating. And Jorge had stepped into the center of the operation, whether Roberto approved or not. But even then, he had a plan. If Jorge failed, the empire could collapse without tracing back to Roberto. If Jorge succeeded, well, perhaps Bolivia would belong to a louder kind of king. For now, Roberto remained still. He continued attending Mass, still walked his estate alone, still received the occasional guest, usually old friends from quieter days, retired generals, aging bankers. One night, a Colombian courier arrived with a letter from a familiar name, someone who'd once shaken Roberto's hand beneath a mango tree. The letter had no words, only a folded photo. It was of Jorge at a table with men Roberto had told him never to meet. That night, the staff at the mansion in La Paz were dismissed early. Roberto locked the gates himself, and for the first time in decades, no one knew exactly where he went. He reappeared 2 days later, calm, neatly dressed, with a short list of names and new orders. Jorge never heard about the photo, but 3 names from that table disappeared by the end of the month, because even in transition, even in silence, Roberto could still reach into a room he'd never entered and remove its air. After the wind down comes the drift. But in Roberto Suárez Gómez's world, drifting wasn't allowed, not by gravity, not by memory, and certainly not by design. Because even as he receded from daily operations, the architecture of his empire remained, coiled, alert, waiting. And so, when the tides of change began pulling harder at the edges, it wasn't collapse that arrived first. It was vanishing. One by one, friends disappeared, not in the violent car bomb way so common in the Medellin headlines. No. These were the silent kind. A pilot who stopped calling in. A banker who suddenly resigned and moved to Canada. A general who quietly transferred to a desk job in Tarija. No noise. Just absence. Roberto noticed everyone. He kept track of them on a folded map in his study, each name marked by a red dot, then struck through with a pencil line when they left the board. There were many lines now. Too many. The empire still functioned, but the tone had changed. The hush was no longer elegant. It was cautious. The Americans were getting closer. The DEA, emboldened by recent regional successes, had begun funding surveillance teams within Bolivia. Locals, often trained in the U.S., now feeding back intercepted communications and whispers from jungle towns. The embassy expanded its footprint. New agricultural attachés arrived with blank stares and sharp suits. Roberto responded not with panic, but with pruning. Entire flight paths were decommissioned. Airstrips razed. He pulled funding from 3 labs and left them to rot under moss and vines. Every document was burned. Every loose end clipped. Then, quietly, he began cutting off some of his oldest allies, not because they had failed, but because they were too close. One of them, a former military commander who had once shared a bottle of whiskey on the hacienda porch, was told by courier never to contact Suárez again. The note, written in Roberto's hand, simply read, "The path we shared now ends here. Be well." That man moved to Peru the following month. Many people still think Roberto was preparing for a final exit, not just from the business, but from the country. So, what do you think? Can a man this embedded truly walk away? Or is the system too tightly wound around him to allow escape? Whatever the case, Roberto's days were changing. He no longer spent time at the mansion in La Paz. Instead, he returned to his estate in Beni, the one where it had all begun, the one with the first runway, the first ledger, the first silence. There, he simplified his life. No more operatives, just a small team, a cook, a groundskeeper, a man who handled the radio. He still walked the perimeter each evening, straw hat low, hands clasped behind his back. But now, the walks were slower, less patrol, more farewell. Meanwhile, Jorge pressed forward. With his father increasingly distant, Jorge assumed more control. He updated communication lines, re-established ties with mid-level Colombian traffickers, began talks with Mexican organizations eager to open new corridors. But Jorge lacked his father's restraint. Where Roberto saw the long game, Jorge saw opportunity. Where Roberto built silence, Jorge invited noise. It didn't take long for the Americans to notice. Suddenly, the DEA had a name they could sink their teeth into. Jorge Suárez. Young, ambitious, sloppy. He traveled too much, made too many calls, and leaned too hard on contacts who were already compromised. One courier in Panama was flipped. A wiretap on a Mexican safe house led directly to one of Jorge's pilots. The walls that Roberto had built over decades, layered, redundant, elegant, began to crack under Jorge's weight, and still Roberto said nothing. When asked about his son, he would offer only one phrase: "He is learning his own lessons." But his eyes, usually steady, would drift toward the horizon. Back in Beni, the estate grew quieter. Some nights, there were no radio calls, no visitors, just the sounds of wind in the sugarcane and the distant, rhythmic buzz of insects that never cared about smuggling routes or extradition treaties. But Roberto still prepared. He kept a suitcase by the door, always packed. He kept two identities. A small plane sat fueled at a remote airstrip few people remembered, not as an escape plan, more like a precaution, the final play, if everything else failed. He also began writing again, this time letters, dozens of them, each addressed by hand, some to allies, some to enemies, some, perhaps, to no one in particular. The staff was instructed to mail them if he ever failed to return from his evening walk. None were ever sent, because he always returned. Until he didn't. The trouble didn't start with a siren. It started with a silence, the kind that prickles the skin more than a shout ever could. In early 1985, the planes stopped coming. Not all at once, but like a faucet slowly turned off. One landing canceled, then 2, then 5 in a week. No explanation. Just rerouted schedules, pilots claiming mechanical issues, middlemen on holiday. Roberto Suárez Gómez knew better. He didn't need a satellite to tell him the network was crumbling. He could feel it in the way the radio lines stayed quiet too long, in how his couriers, usually brisk, confident, started looking over their shoulders, in the way Jorge stopped reporting problems altogether, which meant they were multiplying. The Americans had closed in, and this time, they weren't aiming just at Chapare or Santa Cruz. They were aiming at him. The DEA had established permanent operations in Bolivia by then. Intelligence sharing agreements were being signed behind closed doors. Bolivian politicians, once loyal or at least comfortably corruptible, were being replaced by younger reformists eager to show clean hands to the world. Extradition was no longer an empty threat. It was a formality waiting to be processed. Roberto responded with clarity, not fear. He began issuing what staff would later call shutdown orders. Airstrips were decommissioned, dug up, flooded, or repurposed as cattle pasture. Labs were sterilized and stripped of every tool, every trace. Money routes were collapsed into vaults, cash buried, gold smelted, documents burned, and yet, in public, he remained calm. He still walked the hacienda, still greeted his staff, still took his morning coffee in the stone courtyard surrounded by hummingbirds and orchids, but fewer people came. Calls went unanswered. Even trusted allies in Colombia began to waver. Some didn't pick up at all. Others replied with vague reassurances and no follow-through. Many people still think that by mid-1985, Roberto had already accepted his fate, that he had no plan to fight. So what do you think? Was he surrendering? Or was he simply executing the final phase of an exit strategy decades in the making? Meanwhile, Jorge was unraveling. With the spotlight now on Bolivia, Jorge's operations came under direct scrutiny. Several of his pilots were arrested in Peru. A warehouse in Mexico was raided and found to contain documents tying the shipments to an entity believed to be connected to the Suárez network. Worse, Jorge didn't retreat. He pressed harder, hoping speed could outrun exposure. He arranged flights through lesser-known routes, risky terrain, questionable crews. He even considered negotiating directly with factions in Medellin that Roberto had long kept at arm's length. It was reckless, it was loud, and it worked until it didn't. A plane crash outside Corumbá revealed enough cargo and documentation to link the shipment back to Bolivia. The Brazilian press reported possible high-level Bolivian involvement. The name Suárez was redacted in official reports, but whispered loudly in every corridor from São Paulo to Washington. That crash was the final straw. The DEA made its move. They pushed for Bolivian cooperation, offering intelligence, equipment, even diplomatic favors. The new Bolivian administration, eager to appear aligned with the international community, finally agreed. Targets were listed, properties marked, arrests quietly authorized. Roberto was now officially a person of interest. He got the news not from a phone call but from a gardener. The young man, barely 20, handed Roberto a note slipped into the mailbag by a courier who didn't stay for tea. It was a warning. 2 lines only. Names have been listed. Yours is first. Roberto folded the note without reaction. He walked back inside, removed a small key from beneath a floor tile, and opened a safe most of the staff didn't know existed. Inside was a pistol. He didn't touch it. He only stared at it for a while, then closed the safe again and locked it. He chose instead to make a call, not to a trafficker, not to a pilot, but to a lawyer. A week later, Roberto released a statement through that lawyer. Carefully worded, no admissions, no denials, just a declaration. I have always been a rancher, a businessman. I do not run, I do not hide. It made the front page of La Razón, and yet the next day he was gone, not in disguise, not under cover of night, but gone. Some say he fled to Brazil by boat. Others claim he crossed the Andes on horseback with only a single guard. A few believe he never left Bolivia at all, but simply disappeared into a monastery in the highlands, where he once funded restoration for a 17th century chapel. Whatever the truth, he left behind no trail, no receipts, no sightings, just questions. And the empire? Still there, partially functioning. Ghost ships on autopilot, crews paid in advance, labs empty, but still ventilated, planes fueled, but grounded. It was like someone had taken their hands off the machine but forgotten to unplug it. And in that hum, in that eerie calm, one thing became clear. Roberto hadn't been defeated. He had removed himself, like a king stepping down before the castle falls. If Roberto Suárez Gómez left Bolivia quietly, he arrived in Brazil like a shadow moving across glass. There, but unnoticed. No press, no cameras, not even whispers in the corridors of the border stations. Just a soft rearrangement of names in hotel registries, the appearance of cash where no transaction had occurred, and the silent nod of people who knew better than to ask why their newest guest never took the front entrance. Brazil, with its sprawling Amazon, porous borders, and backlogged courts, was not an exile. It was a holding chamber. A country large enough for someone like Roberto to disappear into, while still making the occasional ripple in the water. And though he carried no passport under his real name, he carried something far more powerful. Stories. Stories that no one wanted him to tell. He was not without resources. Several properties had long been purchased in anticipation of just this scenario. Safe houses, ranches, even a small stretch of private coastline along the Rio Guapore, accessible only by boat or through the jungle. The locals didn't call it anything. They just referred to it as the Quiet Land. Roberto settled into one of these houses. Nothing extravagant. A tiled roof, a shaded veranda, old ceiling fans that hummed in low gear. The air was thick, but he liked that. It felt honest. He brought only a few men with him. Older ones, loyal, quiet. No bodyguards, no entourages, just watchers, not for attackers, but for headlines. If Bolivia shifted too much, or if Jorge made a move too loud, they'd know. But Jorge, it turned out, was in his own storm. After his father's departure, Jorge attempted to step fully into the void, but the system didn't recognize him the same way. The people who once returned Roberto's calls with deference now hesitated with Jorge. He was too fast, too bold, too unseasoned. And worse, he lacked his father's gift for invisibility. Roberto learned this through intercepted calls, letters from old allies, even a priest who arrived one afternoon claiming to be passing through, but carried a carefully worded update folded behind his Bible. Jorge had drawn attention. Again, this time it wasn't a plane crash, it was money. A wire transfer, large, sloppily masked, pinged between two shell companies, one of which was already under light investigation by Brazilian regulators. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough for the Americans to start leaning harder. A week later, a DEA agent publicly stated that Bolivia's narco-financing operations were still active and that a Suárez-led group was at the center. It was the first time Roberto's name had been uttered in public by a U.S. official. The message was clear. We know you're still involved, and maybe they weren't wrong. Because even in exile, Roberto couldn't help himself. He monitored movements, sent advice, always filtered through 2 or 3 trusted voices. He redirected cash flows from Chapare to new holding companies in Venezuela. He suggested, through intermediaries, that Jorge take a sabbatical. He even paid off a judge in Recife to shelve an investigation tied to a transport company Jorge had recently acquired, but it wasn't working. Jorge didn't listen. Instead, he pushed back. He expanded into Paraguay, tangled with groups in Sao Paulo, and brought in men from Medellin whose methods belonged to another era. Violence returned. Small acts at first. A burned-out vehicle. A missing accountant. But the elegance was gone. The empire no longer moved with rhythm. It staggered. Roberto responded by doing something unthinkable. He arranged a meeting, not with Jorge, but with Panama. You see, Roberto still had leverage. A favor once done for Noriega. A promise held by a Colombian banker who now operated in Panama City's quieter districts. A quiet line to a logistics firm that, years ago, had arranged fuel deliveries to CIA-backed airfields. He didn't ask for protection. He asked for a deal. Many people still believe this was the moment Roberto crossed a line, from ghost to player. So what do you think? Was he trying to pull the strings one last time? Or was this a father, desperate to shield his name from a son too eager to burn it? Whatever the motive, the meeting was short. 2 hours in a compound near the Panama Canal. No one knows what was said. But 2 weeks later, one of Jorge's Brazilian accounts was frozen. A logistics operation in Paraguay was shuttered, and an associate who had claimed ties to the Medellin cartel was arrested in Asunción and handed over to U.S. authorities within 72 hours. Roberto had trimmed the branches, but the root was still exposed. He returned to his river compound with fewer visitors now. Even his most trusted men began leaving one by one, retiring, relocating, quietly exiting the long shadow they'd lived under for decades. And Roberto? He didn't stop moving, but he slowed. He started waking earlier, before sunrise, sitting with black coffee and watching the mist curl over the river. Sometimes he'd read. More often, he'd write. Not letters, just phrases, loose thoughts, some in Spanish, some in English, all written in a notebook no one else was allowed to open. His health was good, his mind sharper than ever. But something in his movement shifted, a quiet reckoning. Not guilt, he never entertained that, but perhaps the faint realization that he was no longer writing the script. Only reading ahead, one page at a time, and somewhere, across the border, in rooms he no longer entered, men were saying his name again. But now, they weren't asking for his help. They were asking how much longer the silence could hold. By late 1985, Roberto Suárez Gómez had become something else entirely. Not a fugitive, not a boss, but a lingering presence. A name spoken with a half nod and a downward glance. A story recited in quiet rooms by men who had once worked beside him and now only heard of him. He hadn't disappeared. Not exactly. He was just no longer seen. And still, the system he built hadn't fully collapsed. Like the ruins of an empire whose walls outlasted its ruler, the roots, relationships, and rhythms of his operation continued on, limping but intact. Some airstrips still flickered to life on moonless nights. Some chemists still returned to jungle labs now overgrown with vines. But the elegance, the timing, the seamless choreography, those had faded. What remained was inertia. Jorge Suárez, for all his ambition, could not fill the void. His approach, faster, louder, looser, kept the revenue coming in, but invited all the things his father had once designed the empire to avoid: scrutiny, betrayal, and heat. And the heat came quickly. In early 1986, a coordinated series of raids took place across 3 Bolivian departments. Ostensibly the work of local law enforcement, it was clear these were driven by outside intelligence, likely American. Several minor labs were seized. 4 pilots were arrested. And though none bore Suárez's name directly, the pattern was undeniable. The message was loud. Your time is up. And yet in Brazil, Roberto remained untouched. There were whispers, of course. Stories of Brazilian agents asking questions. U.S. surveillance flights that banked low over the Chapare region. But no knock on the door. No arrest. No headlines, because arresting Roberto wasn't simple. Not politically. Not historically. He had never been caught in possession. Never been recorded giving orders. Never been connected to a product with his name on it. His empire had been built on subtraction, on distance, on deliberately leaving no footprints in the dust. And for some, that still made him useful. There's a story, a quiet one, that in mid-1986, an American intelligence officer, retired but still in the loop, traveled to Brazil on vacation. He took a boat upriver, stopped briefly in the Chapare Basin, then returned home with no photos, no interviews, no statements, just a sealed envelope sent to Langley 3 days later. What was in it? Nobody knows. But a month afterward, a case bearing Suárez's name was quietly closed by a DEA office in Houston. No reason given. Was it a trade? A favor called in? Or simply recognition that prosecuting Roberto Suárez Gómez, after all these years, would reveal too much? So what do you think? Did he broker his own immunity? Or had the world simply decided that some stories are better left incomplete? Whatever the answer, the final stretch of Roberto's life unfolded in near total quiet. He stopped taking visitors entirely. The compound in Brazil remained guarded only by an old groundskeeper and a cook. He gave away books, one by one, to passing priests and fishermen. He wrote letters, but they were never sent. He rarely turned on the radio, and yet, every Friday, like clockwork, he would dress in clean linen, light a cigar, and sit by the water's edge, watching the currents slide past like time itself. His staff said he was content. Not happy exactly, but resolved. He spoke little, ate less, slept lightly, and he never mentioned Jorge. Not once, but Jorge was still very much alive. Now operating out of Paraguay, Jorge had aligned himself with a newer generation of traffickers, men born of the Medellin collapse, raised on stories of his father, but driven by newer, colder logic. Less ritual, more math. Less respect, more ambition. And that world didn't have a place for Roberto's brand of discretion. In that world, names were assets, not liabilities. Loyalty was transactional, and history, just a cost of doing business. By 1987, Jorge was under surveillance by multiple agencies. His associates were being picked off one by one. The Bolivian government, now fully under pressure from U.S. anti-narcotics aid packages, no longer offered him protection. He was too visible and too alone. Many people still think that Jorge expected his father to step in one last time, to make a call, offer sanctuary, send a signal. But none came, because Roberto was done. He had said his goodbyes long ago, to friends, to rivals, even to the country that once bowed to him in whispers. Now, he said goodbye to the silence, too. In the fall of 1987, Roberto Suárez Gómez reportedly took a boat out onto the river at dusk. No staff, no guards, just a thermos of coffee, a notebook, and the sound of insects rising with the evening heat. He was gone for several hours. When he returned, he said nothing. But that night, for the first time in years, he slept through until morning. No radio calls, no papers to burn, no orders to give. Just sleep, because the empire was no longer his. The story was out of his hands, and all that remained was the current. By 1988, the empire was no longer recognizable. The airstrips had weeds growing through their seams. The once flawless radio towers in Chapare hummed with static. The pilots, those tight-lipped veterans trained under Roberto Suárez Gómez's code of silence, had scattered. Some retired. Some disappeared. A few sold their skills to newer players, men who ran things with less patience and more bullets. And Jorge? Jorge was spiraling. The boy who had once watched his father walk the hacienda grounds in silence was now pacing concrete floors in Paraguayan safe houses, surrounded by yes-men and chaos. His attempts to modernize the network had failed. His new partners didn't follow protocol. His rivals didn't respect legacy. And worse, he was running out of money, not literally. There were still reserves, offshore accounts, untapped assets, gold buried in the highlands. But without his father's machinery, the smooth transfers, the unspoken guarantees, none of it moved easily. None of it mattered. He was now a king without a kingdom. The DEA ramped up its presence in Paraguay. A former associate flipped and began feeding information to American handlers. And although Jorge tried to rebuild, branching into alternative routes, experimenting with alliances in Venezuela, every move felt one step behind. He had inherited a throne built on shadows, and in trying to illuminate it, he had destroyed what made it strong. Back in Brazil, Roberto knew all of this. Word came in through strange messengers now. Not former pilots or lawyers, but fishermen, retired officers. One, an old priest from Sucre, arrived with a newspaper clipping tucked into the sleeve of his worn Bible. The article mentioned Jorge, an alleged associate of transnational trafficking, and included a grainy photo of him being escorted by armed men into a nondescript building in Asunción. No charges, not yet, but close. Roberto read it once, folded the page, said nothing. Instead, he walked out to the edge of the river and sat beneath the same tree he had always sat beneath. The tree had grown a little thinner, the roots more gnarled. Like him, he stayed there until the sun dropped behind the horizon and the birds gave way to insects. He didn't return inside until long after the stars had taken over the sky. Here's your historical fact. By the end of the 1980s, Bolivia's role in the global cocaine trade was fundamentally changed. With U.S. pressure increasing and regional partners collapsing under seizures and assassinations, the Bolivian corridor lost prominence. What remained was fragmented, a ghost of what had once been a continent-wide relay. And Roberto? He was no longer part of it. He had become something else. A memory whispered between officials, a name still written on the corners of declassified documents, circled in red, annotated with the same 2 words. Never caught. Many people still think the only reason Roberto was never arrested was that no one truly wanted to face the implications of his capture, the alliances it would expose, the operations it might unravel. So, what do you think? Was he protected by luck, or by the uncomfortable convenience of forgetting? In Bolivia, his name became folklore. The banker of death, the man who bought a coup, the rancher who never touched a kilo, the gentleman trafficker. In the countryside, old men claimed to have seen him long after his disappearance, riding a horse through foggy fields at dawn. Always alone, always silent. Children were told stories of airstrips that disappeared overnight, of gold hidden in chapel walls, of a man who could vanish a judge with a single phone call, but only ever used that power once. None of it was written down. None of it could be confirmed. But that's how legends work. And Roberto, in his final days, never denied any of it. He simply stopped speaking altogether. His last visitor was a young boy. No one knew whose child. He brought bread and honey, asked if the old man needed anything. Roberto, now thin and sun-leathered, took the bread, smiled faintly, and replied, "Tell your father the birds still come, even when the trees don't bloom." The boy nodded and left. That evening, Roberto sat at his desk, opened his final notebook, and wrote just 3 words. Not names, not locations, just a phrase. It held together. He closed the notebook, placed it inside a tin box, sealed it with wax. The box was never found, but the next morning, Roberto Suárez Gómez was peaceful, fully clothed, lying in his hammock, arms crossed over his chest, the faintest smile touching the edge of his mouth. No note, no will, just the silence he had always mastered. The news of Roberto Suárez Gómez's death didn't ripple across borders. It didn't lead the morning papers in La Paz or São Paulo. There were no headlines, no breaking news chyrons, no urgent whispers in diplomatic halls. It passed through the world the way he had lived most of his final years, quietly, like mist fading before noon. A local priest in the Chapare region submitted the death certificate. Cause, natural. No autopsy, no inquiries. The body was buried within 24 hours in a modest cemetery overlooking the river, marked only with a wooden cross and a single inscription carved by hand. He preferred silence. It was, by all accounts, exactly what he would have wanted, but not everyone was ready to let him go. In Bolivia, the whispers came first, then the questions. Had he really died? Was it a staged disappearance? Some claimed the man in the hammock wasn't Roberto at all, just someone trained to play him in the final act. Others believed he had moved again, Argentina perhaps, or quietly returned to Beni under a different name, to live out his days among the cattle. But those who had known him best didn't ask. They understood what the stillness meant. Back in Chapare, some remnants of his empire still flickered, like aftershocks long after an earthquake. A warehouse still received monthly maintenance. A fuel depot near Trinidad was visited once a week by a man who never spoke. An airstrip, long decommissioned, was cleared of brush every few months by workers paid in envelopes with no return address. But it wasn't revival. It was ritual. The empire wasn't operational. It was being remembered, carefully, secretly, like a relic that could still sting if mishandled. Jorge, meanwhile, was in freefall, without the weight of his father's name shielding him. The law finally closed in. He was arrested in Asunción in 1989 on charges related to money laundering and international conspiracy. The Bolivian government, under pressure from the United States, cooperated fully. But unlike Roberto, Jorge didn't disappear. He was paraded, photographed, interrogated, displayed as evidence that Bolivia had turned the page on its narco era. He denied everything, of course, claimed he was just a businessman, that his father had never been involved in drugs, that the entire narrative was fiction. Few believed him. In La Paz, officials who had once whispered Roberto's name now spoke freely, now that the man was gone, or at least unable to correct them. New books were published, documentaries aired. A former customs agent claimed Roberto had once paid for an entire airport expansion under the table. A former judge said he'd been offered a ranch to look the other way. Everyone had a memory. Everyone had a quote, but no one had proof. That was Roberto's final gift to himself. Even in death, he remained unindicted, untried, unconfirmed, a ghost with a cattleman's face and a banker's memory. Here's your historical fact. Roberto Suárez Gómez is still widely regarded as the most financially influential figure in Bolivia's narcotics history, yet he was never convicted of a single crime. His case remains a benchmark in how influence, infrastructure, and invisibility can build an empire more enduring than bullets ever could. In Brazil, his grave remained untouched. Occasionally, an envelope of flowers would appear on the stone. No names, no messages, just presence. And still, in the small town near the river, the stories endured. Children grew up hearing them, about the planes that never made noise, the men who spoke without moving their lips, the old man with maps in his head and a smile that could reroute a convoy. Many people still think he left behind something, gold, ledgers, perhaps even tapes, but none have surfaced. So what do you think? Did he die with everything erased? Or does some part of him still wait to be discovered? What's certain is this: the world moved on. The cocaine trade shifted north. Mexico took the reins. Bolivia entered a new era of political reforms, followed by corruption, then reform again. The jungle grew back over the old trails. Satellites scanned the land, but they found only trees. The silence, it seemed, had won. And yet, if you visit the old estate in Beni, long since sold to a foreign development firm, you might still hear things. A strange hum at dusk. A flicker of light in the trees. The faint echo of boots on tile floors that have been abandoned for decades. Because legends don't need bodies to survive, only believers. And in the case of Roberto Suárez Gómez, belief has never been in short supply. Years passed, the world turned, alliances shifted, borders hardened, and the name Roberto Suárez Gómez faded, not from the minds of those who mattered, but from the mouths of those who once feared him. The media moved on. The headlines found newer villains. The drug war reinvented itself. Cartels splintered and reassembled under new acronyms, guided not by quiet men in guayaberas, but by warlords in armored SUVs. But in the background, the echo of Roberto's empire lingered, like the outline of a river long after it dries. Some of his old associates found new lives. One former radio operator opened a bakery in Cochabamba. A chemist now worked as a high school science teacher in Brazil. A pilot reportedly trained commercial airline crews out of Panama City. They never talked about the past, not to family, not to friends. When asked about Suárez, they smiled softly and changed the subject. And Jorge? Jorge was released after a short sentence. Most of it served in relative comfort, thanks to legal wrangling, strategic silence, and the residue of influence his surname still carried. He disappeared after that, rumored to be in southern Spain, perhaps running a vineyard under an assumed name. Others claimed he was in Uruguay, or back in Bolivia, or gone. No one really searched. No one really wanted to. And as for the rest of the empire, it had become myth. In the highlands, teenagers swapped stories about hidden vaults and buried gold. In the jungles of Chapare, some swore you could still find the skeletal remains of a plane, hidden beneath the vines, its fuselage marked with a barely visible number, RS-1. In La Paz, a tour guide offered a walking tour called the Cocaine Corridor. It stopped at 3 buildings once allegedly tied to Roberto's logistics, 2 of which were now cafes, the third a bookstore. The guide never said his name out loud, only referred to him as El Patrón del Silencio, and people came, not for the facts, for the feeling, because Roberto's legacy wasn't in what he built, it was in what he erased. Here's your historical fact. In 1995, a South American investigative task force released a 600-page report on the regional narcotics trade of the 1980s. Roberto's name appeared exactly once. It was footnote number 318, referencing a suspected financier believed to have influenced the structure of early Bolivian trafficking logistics. One line, no details, no appendix. That was the victory. He had built a kingdom and left no fingerprints on the throne, but some still searched. A journalist named Daniela Morales spent 2 years investigating him for a documentary series. She traveled to Beni, Chapare, even Rio de Janeiro, interviewed ex-police, retired air traffic controllers, aging border agents. She gathered names, maps, transcripts, and then, 2 months before the premiere, she pulled the project. No reason given, no interviews afterward. She now teaches journalism ethics at a university in Ecuador. Many believe she found something, or someone. So what do you think? Did she uncover the final piece, or did she simply learn too late the lesson Roberto spent a lifetime mastering? Silence protects, silence preserves, silence survives. There's a mural in Santa Cruz, faded, mostly covered by graffiti now. But if you look closely, you can see it still. A painted airstrip. A man in the distance, back turned to the viewer, hands in his pockets. Birds in the sky. Jungle around him. The words beneath it read, Los aviones se fueron, pero el patrón nunca despegó. The planes left, but the boss never took off. It's unclear who painted it. The city council tried to have it removed twice. The first time, the workers found the wall reinforced with steel. The second time, their equipment mysteriously malfunctioned. They stopped trying after that, and perhaps that's the point, because Roberto Suárez Gómez, even in death, has not truly left. He remains in empty clearings, in stories passed between generations, in the space between what is known and what is only guessed. He was the banker with no office, the general with no army, the architect of a system that outlived every enemy and nearly every friend. And though his empire is gone, and though his name has faded from headlines, if you listen closely on a still night in the jungle, some say you can still hear it, the soft hum of a small engine, the flicker of a landing light through the trees, a shadow that never needed to land, because some kings die and some kings disappear. Decades had passed since Roberto Suárez Gómez last signed a check, gave an order, or glanced at a shipment manifest. And yet, the world still turned on gears he helped design. Some rusted, others quietly oiled and humming under different names. His fingerprints may have vanished, but his architecture had not. In academic circles, he became a case study, not of violence or power, but of restraint. Lectures at universities in Bogotá and Buenos Aires included him in their curriculums on transnational crime. Not for the bloodshed, for the discipline, for the way he'd fused business sense with criminal scale and moved billions while never raising his voice or leaving a trail. Professors spoke of him as if he were an equation, something to be solved rather than remembered. And then came the declassified files. In 2007, over 2,000 pages of U.S. intelligence reports from the 1980s were released under the Freedom of Information Act. Buried in them were fragments, hints of operations in Bolivia that never made the news, internal memos from DEA field offices, summaries of meetings that mentioned only initials. One memo from 1983 simply read, "RS has declined further involvement. Focus has shifted to Sun. No leverage found." That was all. No photographs, no financial records, no confession tapes, and yet it confirmed what many had long suspected. Roberto had walked away long before the world realized he was gone. He didn't fall, he exited, but legends never truly allow for clean exits, do they? There were always returns. Sightings in Montevideo, glimpses in Havana, rumors that he had been spotted boarding a yacht off the coast of Malaga. A former intelligence officer in Spain once claimed to have intercepted a call between two ex-traffickers. The phrase that stood out, "El viejo aún escucha," the old man still listens. Was it true? Probably not, but that wasn't the point. He had become untouchable not because he was gone, but because he was everywhere. The myths kept him alive, even in art. A filmmaker in Mexico attempted a fictionalized account of Roberto's life. The film was completed, edited, and submitted to festivals. Then it vanished. The director later claimed he'd pulled it voluntarily, calling the subject too big, too shadowed. When asked what that meant, he just smiled. At a gallery in Medellin, a painting still hangs. Abstract, all dark greens and white streaks. In the center, the faint outline of a man's back, arms folded, staring into a void. The plaque beneath it reads, "Suárez en la niebla." Suárez in the fog. And in Bolivia? Well, in Bolivia, things never quite returned to normal. Each new president promised a war on corruption, a cleanup of Chapare, a new era of justice. But the systems Roberto once manipulated remained, reshaped, renamed perhaps, but still influenced by the blueprint he left behind. Many people still think that his greatest achievement wasn't the cocaine empire. It was teaching an entire region how to think in networks, how to move unseen, how to control with silence. So what do you think? Was his true legacy the drugs, the money, or the mindset? There's a house near Trinidad that sits empty. Red clay walls, terracotta roof, iron gate left ajar. No one lives there. No one ever really did. But every few weeks, a car pulls up. The driver gets out, lights a cigarette, waits 10 minutes, then leaves. No one knows why. Just as no one can explain why the power is still connected, or why the lawn is always trimmed, or why the study light turns on some nights, even though the house has no known tenant. You could call it superstition, you could call it paranoia, or you could call it what it really is, a tribute. Because Roberto Suárez Gómez didn't just traffic in drugs, he trafficked in control, in perception, in the art of never quite being seen, and never quite being gone. And if there's one thing the world has learned, it's this. You can bury a man, but you cannot bury what he made invisible. The late 2000s brought a fresh generation of Bolivians to power. Young reformers, digital natives, men and women who spoke in TED Talks and press releases. They referenced transparency. They quoted Mandela. They took selfies from within the chambers of Congress. And yet, every so often, behind closed doors, a particular name would reemerge, not as a threat, not even as a warning, but as a calibration. Would Suárez have approved of this deal? Would Suárez have trusted this intermediary? Would Suárez have needed 4 meetings before closing? His name, even in absence, still defined the gold standard for quiet influence. There's something both poetic and disquieting about a man whose power was invisible, leaving behind a legacy that refuses to disappear. because what Roberto Suárez Gómez created wasn't just a network. It was a psychology, a posture, a hush. It showed people that true power doesn't strut, it waits. That control doesn't mean shouting the loudest. It means arranging the silences, and that the best kind of fear is the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice. In Santa Cruz, a university student researching Suárez's logistics for her thesis was denied access to certain public records, not because they were sealed, but because, as one clerk put it with a shrug, we were told it's best to let that past sleep. But the past never really sleeps, does it? It just waits for quieter footsteps. In 2014, an anonymous donor funded the restoration of an abandoned radio tower in the outskirts of Beni. The tower had long been overgrown, choked by vines, rusted bolts barely holding it upright. The restoration team cleaned it, repainted it, even replaced its defunct generator. No one claimed the project, but the plaque at its base was curious. It read simply, "Para que nunca olvidemos cómo se escuchaba el silencio." So we never forget how silence used to sound. Whoever wrote that understood, because Roberto didn't deal in volume. He dealt in echoes, and the echoes kept carrying, even now. Here's your historical fact. In 2018, the Bolivian Ministry of the Interior finally acknowledged, in a footnote within a 700-page audit, that key government infrastructure projects in the 1980s were believed to have benefited from illicit financing by private actors later tied to narcotics networks. No names were mentioned. But for those who knew, no names were needed. The money was never just about profit. It was a passport, a key, a tool for redesigning influence under the pretense of philanthropy. Many people still think that Suárez's real brilliance wasn't just keeping the cocaine flowing. It was keeping the silence intact. So what do you think? If history is written by the victors, what does it say about the ones who erased their pens before they ever wrote? There's a shop in Sucre that sells antiques. In the back, behind a glass case, sits an old radio. Cracked wood, rusted dial, no manufacturer label. The owner claims it once sat in Roberto's office, that he used it not for communication, but as a reminder. Of what? A customer once asked. The shopkeeper had smiled. Of what happens when you stop talking and start listening. Tourists laugh, locals don't. Because whether or not the radio was real, the lesson certainly was. And while other narcos made headlines, died violently, or faded into scandal, Suárez achieved something rarer. He became a parable, the banker who moved billions without ever being photographed in a warehouse, the rancher whose cattle runs paid for airstrips, the man whose voice was so rarely heard that even those who knew him couldn't quite remember what it sounded like. It wasn't sainthood. It wasn't redemption. It was legacy, tarnished, tangled, but intact. By 2020, most of the world had forgotten him. But in Bolivia, in certain towns, when the rain falls just right and the jungle exhales, people still close their windows and listen, not for thunder, but for engines that no longer fly. The final traces of Roberto Suárez Gómez don't sit in archives or courtrooms. They live in the quiet places, the pause before a name is spoken, the gap in a story where a detail should be, the map with one region left deliberately blank. That is his inheritance. And if you ask the old men of Beni, the ones who watched the rise and watched the silence settle after, they'll tell you the same thing. He was the storm, yes, but he was also the stillness after. By 2025, the world he once ruled is nearly unrecognizable. The cocaine routes have shifted north and west. The logistics are digital now, encrypted, decentralized, faster. Kings no longer ride horses across muddy airstrips. They trade passwords in anonymous forums. And yet, even these men, tech-bred, faceless, fueled by algorithms, study the past. Some idolize Escobar's fire, others Chapo's tunnels. But the smart ones, they study Suárez, because Suárez did what no one else managed to do. He left, on his own terms. No manhunts, no ambushes, no trial transcripts to be dramatized by Netflix. Just a hammock, a river, and a legend that refuses to lie still. In 2023, a podcast series titled The Banker of Silence aired 6 episodes about him. It was beautifully produced, moody narration, archival sounds, careful editing. The host interviewed a dozen people across 3 countries. The final episode ended with a single sentence. If Suárez was never caught, is that because he was better? Or because we needed him to remain a myth? So what do you think? Was it all luck? Timing? Or did Roberto Suárez Gómez understand something about the human condition, about power and presence, that others never did? He once told a friend, quietly over whiskey, at a garden table lit by a single bulb, if you want to disappear, make them remember you for the wrong thing. He was remembered for cocaine, but that wasn't his power. His power was infrastructure. His genius was absence, and his victory was walking away while still being everywhere. Here's your final historical fact. As of this writing, no full biography of Roberto Suárez Gómez has ever been published. Writers have tried. Researchers have begun. But every trail ends the same way, with silence, with contradiction, or with an unexpected phone call suggesting they change the subject. Not many figures can rewrite history. Even fewer can delete it. But Roberto? He managed both. And so we close here, on a night much like the ones he favored, thick with the scent of damp earth, the rustle of trees, the slow, invisible pulse of a river winding its way through the heart of a continent, somewhere far from headlines, far from law, far from noise, where an old man once watched the water move and saw himself reflected not in the ripples, but in the current beneath. Because legends don't drift, they flow. So now, with the jungle hushed and the engines long gone, let your thoughts settle like dew on the leaves. Picture that river once more, broad, unhurried, cradled by trees that breathe mist instead of air. The moonlight doesn't reflect so much as dissolve across its surface. And somewhere, maybe close, maybe imagined, a hammock still sways, empty now, but still whispering stories into the branches above. There is no more running, no more numbers to balance, no codes to encrypt or shipments to track. Just the sound of a fan humming in your room, the weight of the blankets slowly anchoring you to rest, and the faint, far-off echo of a world that once spun faster for a man who knew how to slow it. Let that quiet carry you now. Close the doors behind this tale. Gently, without locking them. Leave a little room for the legend to breathe, for the myth to walk the floorboards one last time before fading into your dreams. You're safe here. He's gone, or perhaps never truly arrived. And you've made it through the empire and out the other side. Let your breath deepen. Let your jaw unclench. Let the night take what remains of this story and file it away among the ones that don't demand answers, only understanding. Tomorrow will come soon enough, but tonight you sleep in peace.